Today's episode of Dominaria's Judgment is brought to you by StarCityGames.com, where this week our sale is bigger and bulkier than ever before. Until Sunday, October the 31st at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time, you can get big savings on lots ranging from basic lands to tokens to bulk commons, bulk uncommons, and bulk rares. There's even an entire pauper cube built by our own Justin Parnell, ready to play right out of the box. All of that and more can be yours at StarCityGames.com/sale.
What's up, gamers? Ryan Overturf here to remind you to check out the 540, Star City Games' very own Cube podcast, where every week myself and Justin Parnell will be tackling topics regarding all things Cube Draft. We're talking set reviews, digital Cube retrospectives, archetype breakdowns, tons of tips on both how to design your own cube as well as play other people's cubes, with plenty of nonsense interspersed. If you're into Cube Draft, we would love it if you gave us a listen, and if you're not, maybe we can fix that. Check out the 540 every week right here on StarCityGames.com and wherever you find your podcasts.
This week's episode of Dominaria's Judgment is also brought to you by Coalesce Apparel, your first stop for Magic the Gathering inspired stylings. Visit coalesceapparel.shop to pick up a t-shirt inspired by fan-favorite Magic personalities, a hoodie from your favorite guild in the Ravnica University line, or just signal your intent to snap Keep in the Dark with an anti-Mulligan Mulligan Club sticker. Want a splash of a commander deck? Check out the Keeping It 100 sticker line and see if your favorite commander shows up there. Whatever you order, use code SCG at checkout to save 10% on your purchase at coalesceapparel.shop. Coalesce Apparel. Nobody made what they wanted, so they made it themselves.
Hello everyone and welcome to episode 29 of Dominaria's Judgment, a weekly modern podcast brought to you by StarCityGames.com. I'm Dom Harvey, I'm here with Ari Lax, and last week we had our Resourcepalooza episode. All the tournaments under the sun, more than you could shake a stick out. This was not meant to be that, and yet I think we actually have more tournaments now than we did last week somehow.
Yeah, we do have a single Magic Online PTQ, but also that's joined by, we finally have the list from the Four Seasons event that we mentioned last week. And there was an NRG series event in Chicago this week that also put up a top 8 as well. That was, I didn't check the initial player count, but, reasonably large. Those events get big, probably a 8 to 9 rounder is my guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we'll start with the Four Seasons list from last week because some listeners did kindly write in to let us know where we could find those deck lists. It turns out that the top 8 split, so there was no playoffs there to get to, no actual first place to crown there. But these results do make for some interesting reading. So we have Dredge, Isn't Murktide, 2 copies of Jeskai Control, I think both 60 cards, one of them with Kahira, one without. And then a burn deck. We had a very interesting build of Affinity, which we'll circle back to in a second. And then old school Valakut, which maybe is also new school Valakut. Maybe that one's come full circle. And then just good old fashioned Tron, So we have some of the new decks and then some also, 2017 decks that have been dragged kicking and screaming into the modern day.
Yeah, and I do want to note that the Jeskai and Jeskai Control is like a Fire Ice and a Wear Tear. It's not like Lightning Helix or anything like that. It's just blue-white with some split cards. Yeah,
this is the kind of automatic classification style of labeling something Jeskai Control where, there's a Raukan Triumph in there, so everything becomes Jeskai just by default. And I would wager that, we see the one Wear Tear in this deck list, and, this one has 2 Wear Tear, so we're really going all out there. But by and large, this is a red source for Prismatic Ending, more so than it is an actual red splash or anything else.
Yeah, the only thing worth noting out of these is I like the access to a Monastery Mentor in the sideboard of one of the lists. That was kind of my thing talking about reworking Azorius, is just having something to dunk on the people who feel like they're trying to go like over the top straight through your counterspells. You can just like, here's a Mentor, I'll counterspell your thing, good luck, you're going to die to it.
Yeah. A good way to keep people on their toes there, and I don't know how much utility it has in the mirror or the pseudo mirror, given that I think maybe you're not priced into keeping in Solitude, but you kind of just want to. It's a flash threat, which you also kind of need against their Solitudes if those are being kept in just as a flash threat too, as the games go longer. So it does get swept up by that, but yeah, sometimes you get to just put them to the test, make them have it. And the nice thing about Mentor is you get into these sequences later on where you play Mentor, they have to pick a fight over it, and maybe you have a counterspell or two to force the issue there. And then when all is said and done, even if Mentor dies, it's leaving some stuff behind, and you can chain that together into something else.
Yeah, I'm thinking more against like the mid-range Blood Moon decks that try to power through is where you want it, where just like they're not going to have a lot of good answers. They might have to like make some weird fights with the Fury or something. But yeah, this let's see. Yeah, I think the only thing we didn't mention, you said burn in there. So let's just get to this affinity list, because I've seen a little bit more of this across other events too.
Yeah, this deck here is labeled as just Saga in all caps, and I like that. I feel like that's an accurate statement about what this deck is trying to accomplish here, because there are no actual affinity cards. Frogmite does not get a look in here. No Thought Monitors, Thought Casts, nothing like that. This is, I'm playing a bunch of artifacts and things which reward me for having a lot of artifacts. So we've got Cranial Plating, All That Glitters as one of our payoffs here. A single The Black Staff of Waterdeep, and 2 Rise and Shine, a card which I have not seen at all since the MH2 preview season. I guess 4 Ensoul Artifact as well. You could call this an Ensoul deck if you like. So a bunch of very old school affinity cards, and then some cards which, even in that show, you didn't see all too often.
Yeah, I'm skimming through here, and I see 0 copies of the Azorius Artifact land, which I love. Like, even though we're playing all these Ensouls and all these Rise and Shines, just not like tap land. Nah, you can keep that one. We're just going to Darksteel Citadel or play zeros and be efficient. I think that's a spot where a lot of the affinity lists get tripped up. Also a Lurrus deck, which is good stuff. Lurrus is a better card than Mirror Enforcer. You heard it here first.
Yeah, it turns out that fake 7-drops do clash with Lurrus, as it turns out. But when all of your payoffs are things like Ensoul Artifact and All the Glitters and Cranial Plating and so on, all of those get recurred by Lurrus. And so I think that's a really nice upside to this deck. It's that if you can stick one of those, you're off to the races. And if they have the removal spell, which they need right now to interfere with that, then the shields are potentially not down completely, but a little lower at least for those mid-game sequences of playing Lurrus and buying that back immediately and then forcing the issue once again. It is also kind of funny that Lurrus, just as a somewhat beefy lifelink attacker, is the perfect thing to put a card like All the Glitters on if you have time for that.
Yeah, another card that's really good with All That Glitters is a Ginger Brute to find off your Urza Saga.
Oh,
I've actually seen a teeny bit of that out of the Hammer decks recently, and I think it's worth considering there. I don't think it's significantly worse than like a Memnite or whatever once you get started, and then having the KO condition of just like actual unblockable Ginger Brute. I'm pretty into that. When I tried the Neo form version of this deck, the Ginger Brute certainly overperformed carrying a Cranial Plating. Though only 2 platings is slightly confusing, but
yeah, you could at least in that deck you could neoform your construct token into a Ginger Brute. If you had to get through a wall of blockers, no such luck here, but you'll find a way. It's fine. Let's can we talk about...
hold up. Yeah. I just realized there's 4 Darksteel Relic in this deck list.
This is exactly where I was going, because normally you see that and you think, all right, that's a transcription error of some kind. Clearly that's meant to be Darksteel Citadel. And then you look at the list and there are also 4 copies of Darksteel Citadel. So no excuses there. I guess the idea is you want things that you can Ensoul up on turn 2 that are indestructible, and that card certainly qualifies there.
Yeah, it is certainly qualified in that aspect. I just 4 Darksteel Citadel, 3 Mishra's Bauble, just 2021 doing some stuff.
I do like that this is also a Chalice of the Void deck, where obviously you can't really put that card in Hammer or Scales or any of the adjacent shells to this, and then some of the bigger affinity decks, they still want stuff like Signal Pet or some other 1-drops which might get in the way there. And yeah, we've got some Springleaf Drums or whatever. We got the 1 Shadow Spear. If you draw that and you can't cast it now, throw a Chalice on 1, that could be an issue. But you have this card which I think is essential if you're going to beat the Cascade decks. I think the nice thing about Affinity is you can kind of outmuscle Rhinos just on creature sizing. You really can't do that with Living End. And so being a full main deck Chalice deck, I think, is necessary to have a chance in that matchup. And then just against the format at large, Chalice on 1 still an all-star. So I like that this deck can enable that. I just don't know if the supporting cast is where you want it to be. Like I don't know about the merits of this approach versus the 4-plating, 4-Nettlesis version that we alluded to in the past, for example.
Yeah, I'm certainly not an Affinity expert, but I appreciate that this is trying something new. I'm concerned about 19 lands Urza Saga, but it'll work out in the end in some way. You can figure out adding a land or two to your deck. Not a huge deal.
Yeah.
Anything else from this top 8, or should we just kick it along to the next one?
Well, we did see this deck in one of the later rounds that was streamed face off against the Scapeshift deck right out of 2017 Modern. So this is the Wish Shift deck that we spoke about briefly. I know Cedric Phillips had a short-lived flirtation with this deck, and I actually like the use of we explained at the time why Wish is something that you might be in the market for, and I don't think you need a Wish sideboard this large. The sideboard here is 4 Veil of Summer and then 11 one-offs, just to help with the, making sure Wish can actually find you what you need in any conceivable scenario. Don't think you need to go quite that far, but it struck me that this exact strategy may be a very clever response to where the format is going, because you look at the 4 color piles, which really were the success story of this weekend, and they have a weakness to big mana in general, but decks like Tron sometimes just fall under the weight of their own inconsistencies. Amulet Titan, you can attack their Titans, you can attack their artifacts and enchantments and lands and so on, and actually stymie them that way. I don't know how the stock 4 color pile ever beats a Valakut deck in a million years.
Yeah, I agree. I think that there is a gaping hole in the 4-color strategy against like traditional Modern decks, which is why I think it took a little bit to lock in. And this certainly falls under that traditional linear. It's got some coverage against like Tron, but even then I'd be skeptical that matchup is phenomenal. But yeah, definitely significantly bigger issues going on when you're playing in Scapeshift, where even if you draw like 2 Spreading Seas in your 80-card deck, like, that's not going to do it.
Yeah, I don't know about the exact configuration here, and this is a deck which has always had issues racing faster linear decks, and I think Hammer, for example, would fall squarely in that category. Burn was always a pretty close matchup, and you had to pay it more respect than I think this list is at the moment. But addressing those issues, I think just this archetype may actually be like a dark horse going into the next week or two. If we're having this comeback tour for Modern, where we're reviving all of these decks from a few years ago, I think this one might belong on that list, honestly.
That's totally fair. I am skeptical because the ceiling on the deck feel like this was always a deck that was capped by the fact that like it never had a hand that killed faster than X amount, or if it stumbled even a little bit, it like hard locked the kill, turn down the line. Whereas Burn, you have a little more flex or whatever. So I'm skeptical of its actual prospects in like the long term, but I would not be surprised to see it sneak into another top 8 this way.
Yeah, I'm thinking back to late 2016, early 2017, where you had the Dredge with Grave Troll versus Infect versus Burn iteration of Modern. And I remember in that era, the Scapeshift decks kind of had to make a lot of sacrifices just to keep up on speed. So you move to this more high variance Through the Breach setup instead of Scapeshift itself. Sabian Spirit Guide, which is a card that really does not mesh with the core conceit of what the deck is trying to do, but you just needed raw speed. So that card found its way in there regardless. Your main deck Chalice of the Void, stuff like that. So you can adapt, you can be flexible with the shell, but there's, as you say, a cap on how fast you can be when you're trying to manually ramp up to cast Removal Titan on turn 4.
Yeah, I think there's also an issue where like I think the best way to compare it is when you look at Burn and they have cards like Smash to Smithereens or Skullcrack, the things that they want to interact with, their cards still like function as main game plan cards to deal with them. Whereas when you like put a Chalice in this deck, it's not a land and it isn't like anything that can produce a land. It's just a distinctly unique game piece that you have to throw away like a draw step in a game when you're already a resource crunch deck. To take care of.
You do have some of those same issues as Burn, where you care about both card quality and card quantity at the same time, which is a rough spot to be in. It means that you mulligan a lot worse, for example, don't really get to take advantage of the London mulligan and everything that comes with that. And as you say, you don't have these interactive cards which are also on plan. So with Burn, Searing Blaze tags that creature and deals 3 to them, and that's one less card you need to count up to 20. with this deck, you thankfully do not have rampant growth plus kill your creature, for example. You don't get to blow up your artifact and also get my fourth land in play at the same time. So you do trick yourself sometimes into having these super reactive draws, which just spin their tires for a while and then die anyway, because you're not actually that much closer to having the time or the resources to cast Primordial Titan with 6 lands here.
Yeah, I think it is, the fact that it is less flexible kind of puts it at least, or at best, in that kind of second tier of linear decks, along with, like, we described Mill and Tron down there, and I think Burn is distinctly more abstractly good than those decks. So I would kind of put this deck down in that, like, lower tier of linears at best.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, something that I think is worth revisiting if you have the time to put it through its paces for an upcoming event. So let's move on to the other paper tournament that we had from this weekend. No update, by the way, on the Siesta situation from any of our correspondents. Maybe the people who had that intel were having a nice nap at home, but we do have the NRG event results from just yesterday. So this is a smaller event with, I think, an 8-rounder, so still a fair number of people and decent quality of competition based on what I saw. So in the top 8 here, the whole thing was won by Mill, I believe. Mill versus Elementals squaring off in the finals. We then had the Team of Crash Gay deck by Conor Mullally in the semis, along with the 4-color Cascade deck, which may be the talk of the town over the past few days. And then rounding it out, just more of what you'd expect. Blue-Eye Control, Hammer, Burn, Is It Murktide? Interesting to see Elementals just in a top 8 at all, which if you'd said that 4 weeks ago, that you just kind of pencil in a copy there by default. But that deck has completely disappeared, and I don't know how much of that is all of its metagame share being given over to these new Omnath Ephemerate decks, or if there's some other factor that has led to its disappearance.
I think that's basically entirely it. It's that the Omnath Ephemerate deck is basically Elementals with good cards instead of Flamekin Harbingers or whatever. So I think it's a tough sell to get people to move back if the extra weird combo power is not needed, which I don't feel like it really is. One of the things I've kind of noticed with these 4-color decks is that they've been cutting the Time Warp kill, which is a sign that maybe you don't need to go that far over the top of everything else. And I guess I want to touch, is the 4-color Cascade deck the Yorion Rhinos deck? Okay.
Yeah, on which more in a second. But I guess Elementals, as a tribe, are still having the last laugh, because Reanimator is now an Elementals deck, and even Rhinos is now officially an Elementals deck as well. So if you want to play with your Furies and Solitudes and Omnaths, you can still do that, but actual Risen Reef itself is being left hung out to dry.
Yeah, that's fine. You know, the good cards are the ones that are free anyways. Risen Reef costs mana. We can leave that one behind.
It costs 3 whole mana, Ari. That's so much.
Yeah, I know. We just don't have time for that in 2021.
Well, what we do have time for is the Saturday challenge results, because this tournament was won by a deck which I know is very near and dear to your heart. It's Esper Reanimator with a lot of Mole Drifters and a lot of Ephemerates.
Yeah, this deck is interesting. It's not... So this is Aspiring Spike winning the challenge with Esper Reanimator, but with an Ephemerate incarnation focus. So Solitude, Grief, Ephemerate, instead of the more traditional, like, Counterspell Thoughtseize setup. I like this in the specific condition that you think that Azorius Control is kind of on the downswing. It's important to have Counterspell in that specific matchup, because you're fighting over, like, you have to play a long game where they're going to force you to, like, interact with their counterspells sometimes, but sometimes you also have to, like, counterspell a Rest in Peace, and just, like, this reactive flexibility of Thoughtseize and Counterspell goes a long way there. Whereas, like, with Grief, Ephemerate, you kind of just, like, fire it off, and then you have a very specific window to hope they don't have the thing. But against a lot of the rest of the decks, I think that having the backup plan of, like, Grief or Solitude Ephemerate is really, really powerful. So I guess we'll get to this in a minute. I like where this deck is trending for the metagame right now. Not sure on 4 Leyline of the Void in the sideboard, but, you know, you've got room to fiddle with.
Yeah, I think Leyline it's a card I've been very impressed by just in the format at large, especially when Is It Murktide was everywhere. It just really shuts that deck down in a way which isn't apparent at first glance, but when you see it in action, you're like, oh, their deck just is a pile of useless cards now. And then we saw Golgari Yawgmoth, or maybe just one person, Demonic Tutors on Golgari Yawgmoth in these top 8s time and time again, and that's going to be true again for this weekend. So it just, and Living End, still one of the top decks in the format, so I think that's a fine use for your sideboard slots, just to cover a lot of your bases there. Kind of interesting to see Thoughtseize in the sideboard, so both giving you less protection, although you buy some of that back with Ephemerate if you do manage to get Archon in play. Also slightly harder to get Archon in play. You don't have those draws now where you Thoughtseize yourself to set that up, and you're going down in cards, but just getting Archon triggers is going to buy all of that back and more. So a bit of a slower iteration of this deck, but you have this weird sideways elementals evoke plan, which I think makes up for some amount of that. Any comment on Stony Silence in the sideboard? I'm assuming this is squarely aimed at Hammer specifically, but how does that card actually stack up against them compared to, I don't know, Kataki is a card which we've seen Spike used to good effect in the past, for example.
You care about Soul Guide Lantern. I think that's really what this statement is that you are trying to shut off other decks' access to their graveyard hate in addition to whatever artifact stuff they're doing. The sideboard card that's more interesting to me is actually the Sarah's Emissary, which is a card that when it was in my decks, I found myself not using at all post-sideboard, and then just because people are going to bring in removal a decent amount of the time anyways, you want Emissary against these hyper-linear decks where you're like, oh, I'm going to shut off creatures against Hammer, but you can't really do that when they're going to try to path your Archon or whatever. So I'm not the biggest fan of it in the sideboard in terms of the end impact in sideboarded games, but it feels like I get why it's there because it looks like the kind of card you're like, oh, I would side it in this matchup. My experience has just been that they always come prepared after game one.
Kind of. I think if you compare a lot of the Hammer lists from this weekend, just to take that as our subset here, I don't know how many of them even have Path of Exile, or On Thin Ice is another card that you sometimes see in those slots. And even when they do, it's maybe 2 copies at most. So I think that's a fine tool to have access to. And sometimes that choice is made for you, where it's turn 3, turn 4, you're on the draw maybe, and just one Archon, or even Archon plus Ephemerate or something, is actually just not enough to get the job done. Whereas Emissary just forces them to find their 2 outer or die in a few turns. So I think that's a fine use of one slot there. Moving down, this was a top 8 broadcast live on Twitch, because we had Aspiring Spike, of course, winning the whole thing. We had Doomwake in second here, Canister in third, Demonic Tutors in fifth, and then Kane Reinhardt, Sneaky Misato in seventh. So over half of this top 8 was streamed, and so that's a great resource to go back and check out if one of these decks catches your eye. But I'm sure Esper Reanimator is going to get the Aspiring Spike bump over this next week. If you're heading into the leagues, I would come packing Graveyard Hate. But then also in second here, Doomwake on 80-card Yorion Rhinos. And like all of the best innovations, this one started as a joke and then became deathly serious by the end.
Yeah, I still don't know what to think about this because I don't really know how much you gain from just shuffling an extra 20 cards in. But at the same time, you don't lose a lot because you just get another 4 Cascade spells. Yeah,
so if you do the math there, it's 8 Cascade spells in 60 cards versus 12 in 80 cards. And what I had in mind last week when I suggested exploring 4 color again was more than 8 in 60 cards, as people were doing in the first week. I did not imagine that things would be going in this direction here. But yeah, 12 out of 80 works out to be a little more than 8 in 60. So you have a little more consistency on that axis. And then you're also just a bit better at this fair game plan. You are just an Omnath deck now, along with 4 Fury, 4 Solitude. So when you get up to 5 lands, which is not trivial in this archetype, and you often find yourself in these spots where if you miss your 3rd land drop, then the game rapidly slips out of reach. So making that 5th land drop feels like a distant goal sometimes. But when you do, have the firepower to compete in those longer games. And and Yorion too, where this isn't a Yorion deck in the way that this 3rd place list from Canister is, for example. You are not allowed to have cards like Spreading Seas or Abundant Growth in your deck for the Cascade thing to work. But this is more just, hey, when we get there, This is another tactic I have access to, and then I'm a Force and Negation Solitude deck, and sometimes you just want extra cards to be able to pitch to those.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think Omnath is there as a 4-color card that has the card colors for the most part. I don't think it's the best companion to this strategy. And same with Yorion. I think there's probably a lot of picking up Yorion to exile it, or as a way to exile. Like, I guess it doesn't really work the best with Force and Negation, but like you can pick up Yorion and know that you have your Solitude or Force and Negation still up, and then like maybe cast it later. I don't think that aspect of the deck adds a ton. This is like one of the reasons I'm questioning this deck. But I guess really the thing that is added is Teferi plus Solitude as a way to manage maybe some of the decks that are trying to outpace the more traditional Rhinos deck.
Yeah, this was an issue for traditional Teemo Crashgate in the past, where your opponent would have a big Murktide region or some big construct tokens from Urza Saga, or even just Tarmogoyf, right? That was part of the impetus behind the Zuma Jund deck picking up a lot of steam, is anything that was bigger than a 4/4 sometimes would just stonewall the entire ground by itself. And now you have Solitude, Brazen Borrower, and Teferi Time Raveler on top of Fire Ice, Fury, and so on as ways to get past that.
Yeah, I will have to put in some hours with this deck to figure out how I feel about it. I'm not 100% convinced it's better than just like regular Teamer with Cryptic Command, but I don't know how much worse it can be, so it's all about the same.
Yeah, I think the main relevance of the pickup Yorion lines with Force Negation is when, let's say you have Violent Outburst, you're in a matchup where you have time, but they might be able to contest your Crashing Footfalls, and so you pick it up on turn 3, and then you can set up a turn 4 where on their turn you outburst and now have the blue card to throw away to Force Negation, where maybe you have another blue card, but it's your second Cascade spell, or it's your Omnath, or something else which you really want to keep around if you can afford it.
That makes sense. Do you want to move on to this sort of interesting hammer build in the 4th place?
I want to talk about this mana base quickly because
okay.
This is a real trip. So we have 2 Reflecting Pool. We've got a Sulfur Force just hanging out in here. We have 1 Branchlock pathway, that's a green-white one, and then 1 Riverglide pathway, that's a blue-red one, on top of the usual Triome, Shockland, Fetchland configuration. So I don't know exactly what the right numbers are there, but it's kind of funny that in this deck, because of the way your casting costs are staggered, it kind of doesn't matter, right? Where as long as you're able to theoretically fetch a Triome, fetch a Shockland early on, by turn 3, when you're actually casting spells, it's fine. You'll have it all figured out.
Yeah, I'm specifically looking at the 1 Sulfur Falls, 1 Riverglide pathway, and
science.
That just, what it says to me is that there's not a huge purpose behind all of it, and that you should really probably change some stuff in the future.
Yeah, Reflecting Pool in particular is a card that I know Aspiring Spike loves to incorporate into his mana bases, so I don't know if there was a sense of betrayal of him having to defeat a Reflecting Pool deck in the finals there, but he'll take it. He'll get over it with the trophy, I'm sure. Let's jump ahead now to Crusherbot BG in 4th place with the Non-Lurrus Hammer deck, and this isn't Non-Lurrus in the burn sense of I'm just going to flex on you by not including a companion and winning anyway. This is, I have actual equipment that costs 3 or more that I want to incorporate into my deck. So in the main deck, that consists of a Nettle Cyst and a Sword of Fire and Ice. And then in the sideboard, we have a Sword of Sinew and Steel and a Sword of War and Peace. So really hating on some colors more than others here, getting through that red removal real good. But if our opponent has any green blockers, then, we don't have the sword to deal with that, sadly.
Yeah, I am going to come out firmly against that configuration. Lurrus is so good in this deck. I cannot actually imagine cutting the card. It is just so absurd.
Yeah, Lurrus is ridiculous. I think the place where this build might actually pick up some ground, surprisingly, is against the control decks, where Nettle Cyst, and we also have Cranial Plating here, but Nettle Cyst, the specific play pattern of I have Sigarda's Aid, I'm presenting a board that they have to Supreme Verdict or deal with on their turn, and then I get to flash in Nettle Cyst and then untap with this gigantic attacker. I think that goes a long way. The swords in general, but specifically Sword of War and Peace against the Fury Solitude decks, where they also have Prismatic Ending, Lightning Bolt, so on and so forth. that card just is terrifying to play against, especially if you can smuggle that one in at instant speed via Sigada's Aid. And then just in general, the bigger equipment, the play pattern there is any one thing. You know, a lowly Mem Knight is now a serious game-winning threat that has to be dealt with. And so you just spend your turn equipping this Mem Knight or this Esper Sentinel, and now they're definitely not paying the additional tax for whatever removal spell they're casting. You just do that time and time again, and eventually they run out of ways to interact with you, and they die. And you are certainly giving up a lot, even in those matchups, by not having Lurrus. But from talking to some of the successful Hammer pilots, they said that this might actually be the way to get an edge in the blue-white matchup, if you think that you expect a lot of that.
Why can't you just play like 2 or 3 cranial platings? You're not legally obligated to play exactly one. Like, imagine every game you have Lurrus and then also multiple cranial platings. Like, I can't imagine that's better than, like, I have a Sword of Fire and Ice. Look out. It's like, what if I just drew a card because I had Lurrus, and then Lurrus drew me another card because it's Lurrus, and then, like, I'm already up, like, 3 Sword of Fire and Ice triggers, and then if one of those cards is cranial plating, they just die anyways.
That also does sound pretty good to me. Yeah, not gonna lie. Yeah, I don't have a good answer on that. I think that's the thought process. But some of the Hammer gurus will have to weigh in. And then this list also has some trademark inclusions for this player, Crusherbot, who was one of the original pioneers of the Hammer deck, you know, even before MH2, I believe. And so you look at their Goldfish page, and it's just the same thing for pages and pages and pages. So a modern one-trick, as some people like to say. But in the sideboard, we see Defense Grid as a card which is a recurring feature of their sideboard. So not something that they're just trying out here. This is a tactic that they seem to have a lot of success with.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to say about Defense Grid in this deck in terms of, like, it's probably okay. I don't know. I like the other inclusions better. I like the On Thin Ices, and I like the Silences.
Yeah, Silence is it's this fascinating crossover card where it's 1 mana counterspell against the Cascade decks, but even better sometimes. And then you can also use it proactively to set up this turn where you lead on Silence, and now you know if the shields are down to shove all in on one creature or not. And it's not even like they can respond to Silence by doing something effective. You know, they kill your Esper Sentinel. Well, sure, but now I'm just going to shove on this Ornithopter instead and get what I came here for.
Yeah, the thing I like is that often if you're, like, going in on a, I don't know, Void Mirror, you know, some, like, actual hate card against the Cascade decks, because of how they're configured, they're just, like, pretty easily able to, like, okay, I'm just gonna, you know, Prismari Command and Force of Vigor all your stuff, and then eventually get around to casting that. With Silence, you're forcing them to actually commit to the Cascade mana, which I think buys you a lot of wiggle room in actually killing them early on.
Mm-hmm. And then we spoke about the first and second place deck lists, a lot of innovation there, and also the fourth place deck list. Let's loop back around to third now, because this is Canister on his latest iteration of the 4-color Yorion deck, of which there was another copy in this top 8. In the hands of Kane Reinhardt, and then Piper Powell used this deck list to win the Sunday PTQ as well, and then I think a few more different builds of that deck littered throughout that top 8 as well. So this deck really has taken over the format at this point, and this is the go-to 4-color good stuff pile if that's something you're into.
Yeah, I mean, this is all the cards we'd expect to see. There's a little bit of trimming on Ephemerate, which makes sense because it's, like, not critical to the deck. It's just, like, nice to have, and drawing multiples can be hard to kind of get your way through. I know my opponents playing 4 have had to Ephemerate and Icevein Coatl a little bit more than I think they would like to. But really, I think the big addition this week are the 3rd and 4th copies of Spreading Seas. That card is just really good, and I think that the importance of having Spreading Seas in your deck as just, like, a goober that when you get to the Yorion point of the game is what lets Yorion cement your victory is really, I think it was underrated in the first builds. I think that all these Abundant Growths and Spreading Seas are a really key part of this deck that was underrated early on.
Yeah, the blue-white Yorion decks got there already because in those colors, you just don't have that many alternative options in terms of good stuff early on that you want to be able to flicker later. Whereas with 4 colors, the world is your oyster. You have so many options to choose between, like the abundant growths that you still see here, like Icefang Cradle, and so on and so forth. But yeah, Spreading Seas, just a fantastic card on its own merits in the format right now. It is the card that you want on turn 2 against so many of your opponents. And then even when it isn't, it cycles to draw you a card, and then it's going to get you at least another card with Yorion later on. You can also pick it up with Teferi to recast again, get another card there. So just a fantastic role player in this deck. And I think the tick up in Spreading Seas, as well as some other land destruction effects, is part of why Utopia Sprawl has worked its way out of the equation here, where that card was already a little bit hit or miss, and I know Canister had expressed some interest in cutting it, and he followed through on that here, in part because getting your land with a Sprawl on it, Spreading Seas, is the worst feeling in the world. And usually when you're devoting 4 slots to Sprawl in your deck, it's because your mana base is constructed with that expectation somewhat in mind, where if you keep the same land count and just add 4 Sprawls, then you're at risk of flooding in longer games. And so you find yourself trimming back on lands, and you're counting Sprawl as some fraction of your white sources and your red sources to juggle all of that and so on. And if you can't rely on that anymore, then Sprawl becomes this very hit or miss card where getting that one, Spreading Seas or Prismatic Ending or whatever, can sometimes cause you to lose otherwise winnable games.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't increased the land count a lot to make up for it, which always makes me skeptical, but I guess there's 2 abundant harvests. Maybe, I don't know, this deck's winning enough that I can't keep complaining about the land count and expect to be like absolutely right. But if you're cutting Utopia Sprawl, maybe you want another land or another abundant harvest above what these decks are typically playing.
Yeah, I also want to give a brief nod to the 1 copy of Emrakul the Promised End in the sideboard, where that is such a game breaker in any kind of long, grindy game, which, and by that I don't mean against a deck like Jund Saga, for example, where they do have this aggressive stance that they're taking. I mean the Mirror, or against Blue-Eye Control, or these matchups where you know from the moment you sit down and both of you reveal Yorion that you need to play fast, and both of you need to play fast, or there's a chance the match won't end in time. Whenever that's true, Emrakul is an absolute all-star, and so love to see that card working its way back in here.
Yeah, I love to see it, and the fact that it's not the other Emrakul certainly takes you by surprise when reading this deck list. But yeah,
hey,
it's...
If they're targeting you with Tasha's Hideous Laughter, I guess it's 13 instead of 15, but yeah, it's fine. You know, it's gonna break that one up. Also worth noting, this is a deck that you do have this weird spread of card types, so you've got some enchantments even, you've got sorceries, instants, you have planeswalkers, which you expect to be dealt with in longer games, and obviously a bunch of fetch lands for kind of free, so you can get a pretty sizable discount on your Emrakul, and then it's also the perfect sync for Omnath mana going long, where if you get to untap with Omnath, well, that's just Emrakul mana regardless, basically. You know, it doesn't really matter what cards are there at this point.
Yeah, 2 horrible standard tastes together again.
You love to see it. So I think that's going to do it for the for that challenge. Do we want to move on to the others here?
Yeah, I think the only one thing that I'll say real fast. Actually, there's one deck I think we should touch on in this challenge. The 8th place Affinity deck. But real fast, Demonic Tutors cutting the 2nd. Geralt's Messenger from the Yawgmoth deck for a main deck endorse. So Yawgmoth players do that. The Affinity deck in 8th place, which is all Mirror Enforcers and Sojourner's Companions. Just noting it's here. I think we've kind of made our thoughts on this deck available in the past. I like that it's more Treasure Vaults and Darksteel Citadels over Spire Silver Bluff Bridge, whatever this blue-red tapland is. But yeah, it's classic Affinity, I guess.
Mm-hmm. So let's go to, I guess, the Sunday challenge now, where, let me load up the Bamzine tweet, which is our go-to method for unpacking this on the day at this point. So Living End, a deck that we haven't touched on much today so far, taking home the title, and then kind of more of what we've seen already. 3 4-color Yorion decks in this top 8, as well as 2 burn decks, a Hammer deck, and Jund Saga. So there it is, more of the same.
Yeah, I mean, 0 Azorius control, therefore Living End wins. I think that's basically the story here, is that as soon as Azorius control starts falling away, you should be prepared to play against Living End again. because that deck is really, really dumb. And the only reason it's not good now is because the most popular deck the most winning deck over the last like 4 weeks has had Chalice to Fairy Counterspell in the main deck. And even then, those decks are starting to cut the Chalices. So I think Living End is primed for a comeback if you're on the cutting edge of the metagame.
Yeah.
And
shout out here to one of our burn players for making I would say, strategically suboptimal choice, but a ethically correct choice in going without a companion, or bringing us to 2 decks instead of 1 without a companion in this top 8. And there was a time where Lurrus was just reigning supreme over Modern, and its authority was unquestioned. Yorion really bad to give it a run for its money now. And so this format, like so many others have been in the past and will continue to be in the future, it seems like it's Lurrus and Yorion facing off once more.
Yeah, I mean, we continue the companion trend. If you look at this PTQ top 8 that also happened today, it's a 7 companion top 8.
Oh, God.
Yeah, so this one does have a mix. There are 2 Kahira decks in the form of the Azorius control deck, but it's 3 Orzhov Hammer, 2 Azorius Kahira, a Yorion Jeskai deck, which I assume is just very similar to like the Azorius Flicker deck. We'll see when the lists come out. And then Piper Powell winning with the 4-color Ephemerate deck. And then kind of sliding into 8th place, we have MTG Milan with no companion. Is Murktide Regent a companion?
Sure, why not? I mean, there was a time when the Cascade decks, whatever you might say about the Cascade mechanic or the play patterns there, those were at least the refuge from the companion mechanic in the Modern format. And now you can't even rely on that anymore.
Well, wait, which can? Oh, yeah, that's true. They're dabbling. They're dabbling with companions.
I am just waiting for the day where we get a Murktide Yorion deck.
I thought we were waiting for the day where we get 80 card Living End.
Sure, if anyone wants to innovate that, by all means, go for it.
Yeah, it's probably a lot worse than the other 80 card versions of the Cascade decks, but you always can. Science never tells you what you can and can't do. Or wait, that's not how that works. But
can we,
in Modern, that's not how it works.
Can we get to 80 card Glimpse of Tomorrow at some point?
Maybe, and I think we should segue a bit into our main mailbag topic, because we might be talking about things of that nature very shortly.
All right, we will do all of that after a short break here. Don't go anywhere. If you want to buy Magic the Gathering cards, we have you covered, but if you want to sell them, that's never been easier too. With a 30% store credit bonus and the fastest turnaround time in the industry, there's no reason to sell anywhere else. Go to starcitygames.com/sell and pick one of 4 convenient ways to sell your cards to us. You can use our buy list, you can ship your cards to us, you can come to us in person in Roanoke, Virginia, and if you have an entire inventory that you want to offload, we can come to you. Go to starcitygames.com/sell for more information. Okay, so let's get into the meat of this episode, what the topic was intended to be, and that's just whatever all of you out there want it to be. This is our mailbag episode. Likely not the last one we'll do of these, but always good after the show is somewhat established to get some proper feedback and directly answer some questions that people might have, especially with SCG-Con and other big Modern tournaments coming up here. So where do we want to start? I think the way we want to group this is some of the questions, there's a lot of overlap between them. And so those are clearly important topics on everyone's mind. And so we'll group those together. And then there's just a kind of a grab bag of just fun one-off questions, which I think we'll get to at the end. Yeah.
So I think the overlapping questions are a really good place to start, because the 2 big ones are probably the 2 most important things coming into this next weekend. And the first of those is, we got this question a few times from Jonathan Riddell, Justin Brickman, and Ryan V. Just variants on the same question of, what decks do we expect to start seeing at these paper events that might have been checked by the Magic Online mechanics? So the deck that kept getting brought up in these questions is Heliod, which I actually think is not of all the decks that could be constrained by Magic Online, I don't actually think that one is especially bad. I mean, we saw it succeed a lot during the Uro era, and I don't think that it has significant constraints on Magic Online. The deck that I think we briefly alluded to that I consider being the most constrained by Magic Online is Glimpse of Tomorrows.
Yes, and for better or for worse, I don't think Glimpse of Tomorrow or Heliod are decks which you should worry about facing, whether in paper or online anytime soon. Glimpse never really found any traction in the format, and Heliod went from one of the decks arguably throttling the format before MH2 to really dropping off the face of the earth completely there. And even at times where it seemed like to us it might be well positioned for a given weekend, it never seemed like there was any follow through on that. So in a way, it's sad that we don't get to actually test that theory of what would the difference be between Heliod at a time when it was 20% of any online tournament and maybe the most consistent performer back in, let's say, March, April, that kind of time, versus if there had been large paper events going on, would it have been even more dominant to the point where people might have discussed action being taken or whatever? That seems like a very abstract question now because the deck's nowhere, so who really cares?
Yeah, it turns out that like having to pay mana for stuff is not good in the era of like every deck finding ways to cheat on mana. So that's kind of, I think, the core issue with that deck is like, if you look at these cards that all cost 3 mana and then your opponent's all having like literal counterspell and like solitude, it's a hard ask. As for the Glimpse deck, I think that the best way to describe the issue with that deck is, so you could always play the stupid Eldrazi version on Magic Online, so nothing on there has changed. The issue is the Loop deck, and that deck is... So these Cascade decks, the things that they lean on are exploiting the free interaction, which is usually stuff that you are actually capped out of playing with Glimpse, like you can't play Force and Negation with that. Or you could play the Elementals, the Incarnations, but even then it's kind of dicey to like play a Glimpse deck where you're trying to pitch cards when your goal is accumulating raw resources on the battlefield before you cast your Glimpse. So I'm kind of iffy on that topic. And then the other thing is the interaction. And again, it's the same kind of question where like you can't just put Prismari Command in your deck. So you're limited in actually picking up the things that make the Cascade decks really good. And you're just forced down this like sort of less interactive, not great linear route, which I don't think puts it in a good spot for the format.
I just have visions of Yorion blinking Chancellor of the Forge now. So if anyone wants to join me down that rabbit hole, you're more than welcome to. But yeah, I think that even before the Cascade decks were hard targeted by the rest of Modern, the Glimpse deck had some structural flaws, or I think had not been fully optimized yet, and no one is really putting the work in there. But now that you're having to slog through main deck Chalice of the Void to Fairy Time Raveler everywhere and so on, it's hard to justify sinking too much energy into that one, I think. But a nice side project to have on the back burner. I don't think there are any other decks that are really affected by just the mechanics of Magic Online in that sense.
Eggs?
That's not a deck. Despite what some people would try to tell you. I actually think the Eggs deck is fairly tame from that perspective because there's a lot of clicking to do, but you get to the point fairly quickly where you have your loop in place and you don't need to actually go through all of the steps. You can just leave some eggs in place sometimes, or you get to this end state fairly quick. The one which I would go back and forth on in both directions is Belcher, actually, where when you have a card which literally lets you stack your entire deck, on Magic Online, you can spend as much time as you please thinking about how do I hedge against this 1% corner case scenario that is the only way I could possibly lose the game. In paper, theoretically, slow play warnings are things that exist, although rare to see those given out in the wild. And so, especially if you're someone who just picked up the Belcher deck recently after its great success last weekend, if you're sitting there trying to deduce the optimal recross pile for your entire deck from first principles, you're going to be eating up the rope there, the real life rope, much quicker than you would otherwise. So there is that constraint. On the other hand, if you're having to go for this weird alternate Pyromancer Ascension loop kill, the mechanics of that are so much easier in paper than they are on Magic Online, where you can just demonstrate the loop verbally and physically, and you're good to go, versus having to make dozens of clicks, perhaps, just to get through one iteration of that. And there are a lot of iterations to get through if you're, if your opponent's making you play it out.
Yeah, that's fair. I think the fact that you don't usually have to do that in multiple games of a match is probably the reason it hasn't been a huge issue online. But I can imagine if you had to kill that way multiple times in the same match, it would be an issue. Going back to the Glimpse decks, maybe there's some way you can go about a non-Cascade version, but I think that's asking a lot. I think the real question is that you might actually have the reverse, which is what decks are good under the Magic Online clock that actually might have issues in paper with slower opponents, because we are coming back to, how many times do you think people have shuffled in the last 2 years, and how many times do you think they will shuffle per game of a fetch land format? I have concerns about Azorius Control finishing games in the Invitational, and I actually wonder if playing Azorius Control is starting off the event with a quarter to half match point handicap based on expectations there.
Yeah, and the draw bracket becomes a real thing at a certain point, and the draw bracket metagame of what you would expect, where if you're playing a deck that has a bad matchup against these Azorius Control decks or these 4-color piles, and you get a draw, your tournament might just be over there and then, because the burn opponents that you want to face, they're not getting draws. The living end opponents that you want to face, maybe they're not getting draws, and so you are selecting for a certain and potentially very hostile subset of the metagame there. And I do think that's going to be a real thing, more so now than ever, where if you haven't shuffled paper cards in a while, and now you're faced with the novel task of shuffling an 80-card deck maybe 5 to 6 times a game, that adds up very quickly. And even just the simple game actions of casting a spell, resolving its ETB trigger, and then doing another thing and doing another thing. If you are bleeding seconds on any of that, it seems like not much in the course of a single turn, but that adds up so fast, especially if both players are guilty of that. And I know that back in the Core Blade era, you would sit your opponents down as soon as you both knew that each other was on Core Blade, and just be like, okay, we both know what's up. Neither of us wants to get a draw, and let's please operate in this match with that understanding if we want to avoid that.
Yeah, I think that is something you have to be aggressively prepared for, is if you are playing a deck that is prone to draws at this event, you should be knowing from turn 1 of the game if you need to be playing to ensure the match resolves. And also, this is a great excuse to, just start shuffling some cards a couple days in advance. This all sounds a lot like we're talking about some video game speedrunning, gotta shave some frames everywhere you're talking about. But that is the reality of playing Azorius Control in a shared clock.
Yeah, there's no way to clip through the sideboarding process or anything to cut a few minutes off. You do actually have to do this the hard way. And lest this sound like we're trying to kind of get an edge in any kind of unethical way, it's worth restating, as we all get back into paper play and the etiquette of that has to be relearned. Judges are there to help, and calling a judge by itself is a neutral action, and just saying, you can even frame it as, Judge, I would like you to watch us both to make sure we're both playing at the required pace. That's fine. You can do that. That doesn't mean that you're making an accusation or that you're trying to do anything that's out of bounds or whatever. That's just a part of the process which is left implicit far too often, and you don't want it to become explicit at a time where you don't want it to be.
Yeah, the things I would say are, you and your opponent, you should try to make the agreement with your opponent early that you understand this match could potentially come to a draw, and that would be bad for everyone, and that we should play at a pace that helps that resolve. But the other thing I'll say is that if it does not look like that's happening, the time to call a judge to try and prompt faster play is earlier rather than later, because again, you've bled off however many seconds if you call the judge with 15 minutes left in the round. If you try to make, it will be clear within the first 10 minutes what the pace of play over the match is going to be. And you should try to fix that at that point so that you aren't stuck starting game 3 with 5 minutes on the clock. Absolutely.
Another question related to Magic Online, which we got understandably from a lot of different people, is what do you expect the differences to be between the online metagame that we've watched develop over the past few months and the paper metagame for events in general, but specifically for SCGCon as well, where it's a split format event, and for many people, they're kind of free-rolling the invite that they earned 18 months ago at this point, and maybe have not kept up with Modern in the meantime, so they're frantically trying to source cards. Or if you're someone who, and there aren't that many of these people, but the people who did qualify online on Arena via Standard, for example, maybe they don't have any Modern experience at all, and they're listening to podcasts like this, or they're frantically trying to get up to speed here. What are they going to converge on? And so I think that creates a different set of expectations coming into this for this event maybe than for any other.
Yeah, it was interesting to me, by the way, the spread of people that we got asking this question. So I'm going to list the 4 names that I believe specifically kind of, or 3 names. So we had Zach Allen, Dave Long, and Ethan Johnson were the people talking about paper versus Magic Online. And you might recognize 2 of those names as people who have like significant Star City Open resumes. And they're the ones kind of wondering about it because they don't know what to expect right now.
Yeah, the paper boomers who have been in their hermit holes for the past 18 months, just hibernating there. So where do we want to begin tackling this question? Because I think it's hard to give a definitive answer, and it is nice now though having the 4 seasons results and the NRG results and so on and so forth, where we do have these paper tournaments and the deck lists from those trickling in, and so it's a small data set to be sure, but we can make some inferences from those, I think.
Yeah, I think the big thing right now is that while Modern has changed rapidly over the last few weeks, it has changed in ways that are like archetype consistent with the past. So the one thing I'll note is I would expect a lot of additional Temur Crashgate at these events, in part because it is a deck that people could have prepared with for several months and are fine just like changing the 5 cards for this week and just playing their same deck from before. I would expect, like, you saw that a lot in the past with like Affinity just continuing to show up because it was good and you could play the Affinity deck from this week. I just think that like the decks specifically, like, it's not like shocking to say that these are the best decks and like people will show up with them, but I would expect a bit more of them relative to like Demir Mill when you start talking about the paper results. The other thing I think I would point out in terms of paper results, I think that you may actually see more of the 4-color Ephemerate deck in paper than on Magic Online, because I think that while there are similar price concerns in both mediums, I think that there is actually like a more when you are going through a rental service where you cannot actually physically put all the cards on your account due to a cap, it's harder to actually start playing the 4-color deck because you have to like invest an entire additional resource. Whereas in paper, the loan programs of asking your friends if they have solitudes tend to be a bit more forgiving on the actual cap.
Yeah, so that is a big difference that is worth unpacking. If you think back to the first week with MH2, where you could not get Ragavans or Urza Sagas in a lot of the rental services, and there was just low supply on those eventual staples of the format, that was something we noted as this factor underlying a lot of those early results. But we assumed that things would settle into this normal-ish equilibrium after a certain point, which for the most part they did, but especially with the ascendance of these 4-color money piles, as I know some of the grinders like to call them, when those are off limits, even for the highest plans on a given rental service, of course, that's going to put a cap in place for how much of those you can expect to see relative to, you know, their true representation in a perfectly liquid format. And so, yeah, I think that noting that the 4-color Ephemerate deck is doing this well, even given that constraint, that really is a testament to that deck's just abstract power and also staying power in the format, I would argue. Now, how that's going to convert into paper for this coming weekend, where, you know, not easy to source all of the cards for this deck from nothing if you decide this is what you want to play. And that tactic of going to your friends and asking, do you have any spare solitudes or whatever, I think that's, firstly, it's harder when you need solitudes and Ren and 6s and Teferis and Force Negation and so on and so forth. And maybe you can get some amount of that, but you need it all. And if you're missing one part, then that's still a hefty financial burden that you have to get through. On top of that, I don't know how many of those cards have made their ways to players yet, if that makes sense. So previously, if you needed a modern staple, it was likely that someone in your friend group had that card sitting in a box for a few years, and you could have access to that, assuming they weren't using it themselves, or assuming not every single person in your group wanted to play that deck. Now, if, you know, half of a group of 8 people want to play Solitude, I don't know if there are enough Solitude to go around. I don't know if everyone who, even the people who you could rely on getting that stuff from previously, I don't know if they have all updated their collections to the point where that's something you can take to the bank.
I think this being a multi-regional invitation-only event probably helps with that, where you can ask your friends up in Baltimore and, how many of them are actually going versus not, and some of them might have some of these cards. So I think that might resolve itself to some degree.
There is an additional wrinkle for this split format event too, where there is also standard to consider. And I know a lot of people are going through the motions of like, do I want to be buying a playset of Godspan Dragons, which I might literally never play in standard again, and just only for this one tournament? And I know Rodney Bedell has single-handedly is like fueling the the standard metagame for this event just by, I have a lot of standard staples, and these are the ones that I can assign to certain people, and so that's going to inform what decks people are going to have access to. So there's that wrinkle too, which is unfortunate, and I kind of hope that paper standard play returns to the point where it makes sense to actually acquire cards for a physical standard deck, but I don't know if we're there yet, honestly.
No, I wouldn't say for standard. I think modern's in a pretty good spot. I don't really want to speculate what's going to happen with the standard meta, but I think we kind of covered most of what we expect from the modern meta. I might expect a little more Azorius control in paper than I would on Magic Online in the classic, like, a week and a half behind because this is what they're playing and they have the cards. But there's probably still a lot of that online, just a little bit less in the top tables than we saw the past few weeks. Maybe a bit more Junding just because people have a Jund affinity. I don't know. I don't think you're going to see a noticeable difference because, like, the other thing in paper is like, yeah, you could always cite the Burn player showing up, but like Burn is one of the best decks. So whatever, they're just going to show up with Burn and be in a good spot.
Yeah, I would expect quite a bit of Living End actually as a deck which has been proving itself consistently over the past few months. And so you very easily could have concluded 6 weeks ago, I want to play Living End at the Invitational. I'm locking that in and I'm going to acquire the cards for that and start getting the reps in for that now. There's only one like specific expensive card in there in Force Negation, which you might not have already. And maybe you did. And if you do, then the rest of the deck kind of builds itself for the most part with the rest of your modern staples and then also a bunch of draft box commons from 8 years ago. And it's just a very straightforward deck in the sense of the game plan is pretty obvious. It remains consistent over time, and it's kind of clear what your counterplay is against any given opponent. And so if you need a deck which is like cheap-ish for what it is, simple-ish for what it is, and it kind of maps onto maybe you have experience with the Cascade decks before, I think Living End ticks all of those boxes. Likewise, Burn as a deck which actually is a budget deck for the most part. Easy to pick up, easy to play. Lots of people just own a Burn deck, whether it's their main deck or just they own the cards because why not? And is all through these top 8s, even with people paying more attention to it now, there's always been more Burn and more Tron in paper than maybe there should be for a given weekend. I think there should be a lot of Burn this weekend, and I think there will be a metric ton of Burn this weekend.
Yeah, we keep saying that we expect every deck, so maybe it's just we expect a flatter metagame. Like in Magic Online, you can get more polarized metagame shifts, whereas in paper, like there are 10 to 15 decks that are going to be good, and the percentages are going to be relatively closer across the board than they might be on a Magic Online event. Maybe that's the final takeaway. I don't think you're going to expect to see significantly different things, and I don't think you're like trying to prepare for some tier 3 deck because people like it. I think you just have to have a good idea of how your deck performs across the spread. That's the best I can say.
I think one trap is easy to fall into is reacting too much to the most recent set of results. So for example, let's say you have a modern deck soft locked for the Invitational, but you're looking at the results here as we talk through them and, oh wow, Aspiring Spike of all people just won with Esper Reanimator, or Dubreak, who a very popular modern streamer, influential voice about the format, pioneering this wild new take on Crashgate. How much of that is going to carry through into paper? I would say not too much, probably. You'll have a core of grinders who will frantically test those decks over the next few days, and if they like what they see, maybe they make that jump. But for the most part, I think people are going to play the decks that they decided on a week or two out, and maybe they shift a sideboard card or two to adjust to this new reality. But in terms of being part of that reality themselves, I don't think too much will change in that direction.
Yeah, just be aware that these like alternate builds exist and then move from there. Do you want to start on the invitational side of this question? Because that was, I know Kyle Bogmus had asked that question, and we also got that from David Booker about like, how do we expect to kind of, with an invitational level event and this kind of stuff, what would be our approach to selecting a deck for it? And how should we prepare specifically for an invitational?
Yeah, I will say as a concrete example, so deck winning with Belcher, I would not expect to see Belcher at the invitational.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes,
so
good point.
Where, by contrast, if you played the online event, so for this weekend, there was a decent amount of Belcher, from what I could tell, just watching people's streams and anecdotally hearing the feedback. And so if you were playing a deck that was weak to linear combo and to Blood Boon, you were going to have a bad time, whereas maybe those decks as a class are more viable for the invitational. So that's, I think, a concrete takeaway that you can have there. As for Kyle's question, so I think it's worth actually getting into the specifics here. So Kyle asked, when I play events where the average skill level is low, I opt for consistency over power. When with a higher skill level on average at the invitationals, for example, but also higher variation, where would you draw the line on flex slots being geared towards consistency over power? So does this question make sense in terms of like, you hear this this framing a lot of, well, I expect, this field is stronger than this field, and therefore I want a deck which gives me more agency because I can leverage my play skill better. And when you actually get deep in the weeds on that, I don't know if mathematically that's a coherent stance to take. Where do you come down on that?
I think this tends to matter more for events where the metagame is less defined, where you're like, this was like an old Pro Tour question where like you knew what the best, like the two decks you expected the most of against the field were, but like also anything could happen on the day of. So you were like kind of like, I want my deck to beat these decks, but also be prepared for anything. And how do I balance that? I think right now, the flex slots are like more defined in terms of like Modern has a wide but defined metagame, and you just kind of are like, I should know what my flex slots need to address and address those. So I would, I think the key, it's not consistency over power. I think the question is coverage in this case. For this specific event, I think that's something that also plays a role into this. If I was reading the event structure correctly, is the invitational, the top 8 is standard, but the second rounds on each day are modern, which means that you are more likely, if you are doing good in the event, which is the relevant question, your modern deck should be geared towards the players who are also doing good, which is presumably more experienced players in general. So I would, again, talk about like coverage and having cards that are giving me the actual leverage in matchups instead of playing necessarily like the most linearized version of a deck in order to override the person who decided to show up round one with like hardened scales because that's their jam. Because I don't think that, I think at this event especially, because we're going through effectively this reset of Modern Horizons 2 and coming into paper events, there is the players you expect to be muscling their way through to the top ranks in standard, where you're also hoping to be, are probably players who are not like established tier 3 archetype stands because they're like, they haven't had that chance to like, they haven't been playing hardened scales at every SCG Open every weekend for the last year and a half. So you're just likely to get a spread of the good decks. And I would not try to overcorrect a deck to be like Crashgate, I think is a really good example of this, where like right now you see this loop back around to Cryptic Command because you need to specifically attack the other slower decks, and having like a powerful counterspell helps that. I would not overcorrect that Cryptic Command back to like Bone Crusher Giant because feel like you need to be faster against like an unknown metagame. I think you can say that the modern metagame at this event, like we said, is going to be relatively known, and I would not sacrifice coverage for power in this case.
As you note, there is a unique structure to this tournament that has to be taken into account, where Modern is both the the less important format by a decent margin, where the top 8 is standard. So if you're trying to optimize for the really top outcomes in the tournament, then you should devote your time there. And then also, if you're doing well enough in standard and then muddling through the modern rounds, you might get to the point where you can just draw the last few modern rounds so they don't matter. And so you're taking those out of the equation too. So if you just care about preparation for this one tournament, I think standard is where you should devote your time. And as you mentioned, with modern being the second format on both days, the lesser players in both formats are going to be weeded out in the standard rounds for the most part. But there's this weird subplot there too, where if you are someone who, let's say, you play a ton of Arena, you're good at standard formats in general, but you just don't dabble in Magic Online or Paper, so you just haven't played Modern, then maybe you rock out to this tournament with the standard deck either that you qualified with or you've come well prepared for standard, you ace the first few standard rounds, and now you're in the shock-infested waters of Modern, a format which you've played not much of, if anything, and a lot of people have, and maybe you wanted a pick-up-and-play Modern deck like Burn, like something linear where, you can't just write those players off as the ones who haven't been keeping up in Modern, because they might be legitimately very good Magic players who just have not had a reason to keep up in Modern, but you can't expect them to fall at the first hurdle in Standard either.
Yeah, that's fair. But again, I think some of that is just that the Modern metagame right now is taking into account those pick up and play choices because they are among the best decks. So I don't think it's you have to consider a alternate tier of strategies that you have to cover for. I think it's just baked into the making sure your deck is just generally good right now kind of equation.
Yeah, I think that question of consistency versus power as it pertains to play skill of the average opponent, it can come up on a card-by-card basis in the sense of, for example, against Hammer, an inexperienced Hammer player who is walking into Solitude, for example, or Force of Vigor, those cards are going to be much better against an inexperienced Hammer opponent versus the kind of Hammer opponent who, if you're facing off playing for top 8 in round 13 or whatever, you can't rely on racking up those free wins in that way quite as easily. But I don't think that the question, I don't think you should be making otherwise unnecessary or suboptimal card choices just with a view to, I can kind of cheat here because I don't think this class of opponent is of a certain caliber. I don't think that makes sense. What I think does make sense is gearing your deck towards, so for example, that one copy of Emrakul the Promised End in the sideboard of the 4-color deck, if you know that you'll be playing these mirrors where on turn 10, you're casting the same expressive iteration for the third time this game because you've been looping Eternal Witness or whatever, and you need some kind of endgame to dig towards, that one card, even in an 80-card deck, that really matters in terms of your long-term planning versus you're paired against Burn and turn 10 is not going to happen. You need your sideboard card right now, and the way to do that is to have enough copies that you don't need to be can-dripping towards them or keeping a weak hand and hoping to draw it in a certain narrow window. You need to be able to find those cards consistently. And so I think gearing your card choices with that in mind is more important than any kind of abstract thing about, these opponents are worse than this ones and therefore this instead of this.
Yeah, that just sounds like you're advocating for good deck building.
Yeah, I guess that's it. Not to fire shots to Kyle here, but I think that just sticking true to the fundamentals there is more important than trying to next level the tournament in this one specific way.
Yeah, I think that maybe in past iterations of Modern, that may have been a different question because, like we said, Burn was less of a top tier contender. But I think right now it's just kind of condensed in such a way that you can conveniently just build a good deck and just have the coverage against the field.
Yeah, I think if anything, the question makes sense from the other standpoint is, if I do not have the resume of Akaya Bogomies and I feel like I'm out of my depth coming into this tournament, how should that inform my card choices and deck selection? I think that is a fine argument for picking one of these more simple decks where you can get close to the ceiling of it without too much trying, whereas I would not want to pick up the 4-color deck for my first Modern tournament, for example, because I'm going to need to figure out how to line up my cards correctly without getting any slow play warnings or any draws in the tournament. And then also, if I get into these protracted mirrors or I'm against blue-eye control and I need to have a long-term plan in place, you don't want to be figuring all of that out on the fly. So I think for those people, that question makes a lot more sense than from someone in Kyle's position, actually.
I actually would push back. I think the 4-color deck is just powerful enough that like you can figure it out on the fly. I think the 2 decks that come to mind that I would have concerns with picking up, actually 3. So I think that Azorius Control is a much better contender there because it's a lot more on narrow edges because some of its cards are distinctly not good in certain matchups. Whereas like you can just like Omnath, Fury, whoever you want out of the game. I think Is It Murktide is like very clearly a high skill bar and like something you should be relatively confident with before you start playing. And then the other is Hammer, which I think is just like the most complicated deck in the format.
Yeah, and you will get a lot of free wins with the Hammer deck, and that is a reason to choose a deck. There's you don't get extra credit for having to work for your wins, and often it's kind of not arrogant, but assuming that you can unlock all of the wins that are on the table is that's not always going to be a true assumption. And so just take your wins that have been given to you where you can. But also, as you say, it is very easy to throw away games with the Hammer deck where your curve is so compressed that you have so many sequencing choices on each turn, starting with turn 1 a lot of the time. And you have these questions of how do I want to play against a potential Solitude or Force of Vigor or just generic removal spell? And how do I, there are so many of these choices which, if you've decided to play Hammer in this tournament and you haven't practiced already, please find time to practice if you can, even if it's just those first few matches where I think that goes a long way. And however many diminishing returns there are on additional practice, just don't play Hammer blind. I mean, if you're legitimately a fantastic Magic player and you know that, and you're willing to play the tournament on hard mode, fine, so be it. If you're Brad Nelson and someone hands you a Hammer deck on the morning of the tournament, okay, you're probably going to be okay. But for the most part, be aware of the demands that your chosen deck is going to place on you and try to orient your preparation time and process towards that.
Yep. And then I guess we'll round this little bit of this out before we get into some more specific questions with, I guess, Will Kruger had asked most popular decks and what we think are the best choices. And I think we can tie in Dave Booker's question about like our selection process, because we've talked about the most popular decks. We think it's going to be the good decks pretty well spread. But what would we play at this event and why would we do that? I actually submitted my article on this this weekend, and I have 4 choices laid out that I would play, and then another 4 that I think are like top 8. But there's 4 specific ones of that 8 that I think I would have on the table at this point. And kind of talk through why that. Do you have a list of decks that you have as like a short list?
I do, yeah. I'm curious for you, how much overlap is there between what you expect to be the most popular and what you expect to be the best choices?
A lot. I believe, let's see, 5 and a half of the decks I would consider to be the most popular ended up on that top 8. The top 8 that I had included Azorius, 4-color, Hammer, Crashgade, Burn, and then Isn't Murktide is kind of the one where I don't know how popular it will or won't be. And I think that those are like obviously among like the most popular and best decks, right? Like there's a lot of overlap there.
Yeah, from the paper tournaments that we do have results for, it seems like most of the top decks from Magic Online have fed through into paper. So you're seeing a lot of Control, a lot of Murktide and Cascade decks and Hammer and so on and so forth. So the differences there are not too vast. So my short list here, so most popular decks, I would say Burn, definitely going to be up there. Hammer, I would expect to see a lot of various grindy decks, probably more focus on blue-white than on 4-color, I would say. If the tournament was even a weekend later, maybe that would change a little bit for me. But for now, I would expect more blue-white than 4-color. And then want to make sure I'm not forgetting something big here, but both
Cascade.
Footfalls and Living End, I expect to see a lot of. And then that covers it for the most part, unless there's some glaring omission there.
No, those are those are the decks that I expect to be the most represented. But like I said, I expect a lot of the other stuff in reasonable quantities too.
Yeah, I don't think this is thinking back to the last Invitational I played in the Simic Urza format, where like one variant of that deck was 20% of the room, and then another variant of that was like 10 to 15%. I don't think we're in that territory by any means. I would be shocked if any deck was more than like 15%, and honestly, maybe one or two decks will broach 10%. If I had to guess.
I agree with that exact assessment. I just don't want to think about the card Oko ever again, so it took me a minute.
Yeah. As for what I think are the best choices, so there's the best choice for me, there's the best choice for someone who is still undecided as of, this going out on Tuesday and the tournament starts on Friday. But leaving all of that aside, I think just best decks in Modern in the abstract, Hammer and Living End. Some kind of blue-white deck or four-color deck. I think the rise of four-color to some extent boxes out blue-white. At least that's kind of what we're seeing on Magic Online. I think the blue-white decks maybe kind of readapt to that, but it's going to take a little bit of time. And on Magic Online over the next few weeks, I would expect to see a slight resurgence of, big mana, for example, or these decks which just fundamentally go over the top of what the four-color decks are trying to do. I think the lag there with the way that this tournament is scheduled means this might be actually the perfect weekend for four-color. If you have a list that you like, you can play that, and yeah, you're going to be chewed up and spat out by the people who have been playing Tron for the past few years, and of course they're just going to show up with that again. But for the most part, I don't think that backlash will have translated to paper in advance. And so, yeah, I would say Hammer and Living End, and then the right build of four-color, if you think you have that and you're confident you can play it, quickly and efficiently and optimally, then I think those are the three. Those would be the big three for me.
Yeah. So my three, very similar. I had Hammer, four-color, and Teamer as the top decks. I'm still a little skeptical of the Azorius decks, like sweeping out of the way to play Living End. So I'd be leaning towards Teamer, Crashgate. I think that that's the overlap of like the two default best decks that are still very good. And it's like, you should always have that kind of like, well, this is the best deck. There's no reason for me to consider it to not be the best deck. Therefore, I should be considering it for the event. And then I think the four-color deck is kind of like, this is the best up-and-coming deck that's good against like a lot of the best decks. Then my fourth deck was Dimir Mill. And that's kind of the gamble outside shot where I have to consider like, if I expect the metagame of the best decks to look this way, what is the thing that I would show up with? And it's very specifically Dimir Mill, because I think that it is a deck people are less prepared for than Boros Burn right now. That is sort of harder to prepare for than Boros Burn, because like you can put some Sunset Revelries in your sideboard and like they do things elsewhere, but like you have to mean it with an Emrakul. And very specifically, I think that Dimir Mill is lined up better against the four-color decks than Boros Burn is. And I think Dimir Mill is like pretty good against Hammer. And like those are the two reasons to play Dimir Mill over Burn. And I think that things are lining up in such a way that I would consider it over Burn in that kind of like linear gamble slot. And that was my top four.
Yeah, I think Mill is potentially a very smart choice. Coming back to kind of what Kyle was getting at, it might be a higher variance choice in the sense of your matchups are pretty polarized, and yeah, you might run into a bunch of Burn all day and get dumpstered. And that's the thing which I think would scare me off Mill, is I would expect a high quantity of Burn in this event, and maybe you just you take the L there in game one, and then your matchup is, your sideboard is very heavily slanted towards that matchup. I could see that being smart. But yeah, otherwise, among the top tier decks of the format, I think Mill looks pretty good. And then among the fringes, the stuff that people just show up with to tournaments, it's kind of split down the middle, where the big mana decks or the combo decks, Mill is phenomenal against. And then some of the weirder like aggro decks or mid-rangey decks just accidentally line up very well against Mill, and there's not much you can do about that. But if you're happy with just getting your money on good and hoping that you get to realize the equity there, so to speak, then yeah, I think Mill is a great choice as well.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that covers it for like metagame level questions. Let's take a quick break, and then we can jump into some of the more specific mailbag questions and rapid fire off some yes, no, maybe good answers.
What's up, everybody? Cedric Phillips here, stopping by real quick to let you know about one of Star City Games' newest podcasts, The Receivables, hosted by yours truly, alongside my partner in crime, of course, Patrick Sullivan, where the two of us discuss Magic sets, both past and present, from top to bottom. On every episode of The Receivables, you're going to hear us talk about the facts of a set, the mechanics of a set, the cycles of a set, you know, the boring stuff, before we get into some crazy stories of when we were playing Magic during the times that the set was legal. We've got a ridiculous award show where we give out awards like the Char Rumbler Award for weirdest card in a set, the Oko Thief of Crowns Award for best card in the set, and a whole bunch more. Before we finally decide, hey, what card won the set and what letter grade should we give the set? It's a whole lot of fun. We're having a blast recording them. Hopefully you have the opportunity to listen to it and you enjoy it as much as we're enjoying recording them. Where can you find it? StarCityGames.com or wherever else you listen to your podcast. The Receivables every single week here at SCG.
Okay, so let's get to some of these miscellaneous grab bag questions here. And I think these are always the most fun parts of a mailbag segment. It's just rapid fire stuff coming from every which way and covering as much ground as we can. So let's start with Eric Virgo. Is Abundant Harvest a good cantrip looking for a home, or is it just too low power for mod? What's your take on that?
I think it's a very good cantrip. It's looking for a home. I, however, am coming around to the opinion that 1-mana cantrips in Modern are a lot worse than they look. That said, it's seeing a lot of play in the 80 card Yorion decks right now, like as a couple, and I think you could see more of that. I think Harvest is on the right side, but it's kind of on that borderline. I don't think you want to put, I don't know, we can have this discussion another time about whether Preordained belongs in Modern, but it is on the right side of like the unplayable line, whereas like Consider has struggled to find a foothold to the same degree.
Yeah, Abundant Harvest is not good at finding specific things. And so that's why going back to the early weeks of the format, you saw Amulet Titan with Abundant Harvest, and then that card just found its way out of the deck because when you needed specifically a bounce land, or you needed specifically Primeval Titan, Summoner's Pact, the odds there just didn't line up in your favor. Whereas in these 4-color decks where no one card is that important or that time sensitive, Abundant Harvest has a little bit more time to shine because you need to avoid flooding in longer games, but always make at least your first few land drops. In that kind of setup, Abundant Harvest is exactly what you want. So I think that's going to be its natural home moving forward. I think it's a fantastic card, but there is this tension where, in theory, if all of your cards are super cheap, then you have more opportunities to weave in another one mana card once you get to 3 or 4 mana. But then also, when all the cards are that cheap, the bar is higher for any given 1 mana card to edge out the other things you could be doing with that mana instead on your early turns. And so that idea of, I'll take turn 1 off to Abundant Harvest and see what happens, that is much harder to justify, when the format is structured the way it is right now.
Yeah, and when, you don't really need the card selection because of the London Mulligan. It's like long game card selection is just less important because you're more likely to start off from a good position. So I guess you want to jump into the next question because it's sort of related to where Abundant Harvest sees play.
Yeah, from friend of the show, Jarvis Yu, how do you make 60 card 4-color ephemerate pile with Time Warp work? I think it's actually pretty easy to do that if you want to, because a lot of the padding that Yorion makes you play is only there as a nod to Yorion in the first place. So in a 60 card deck, I don't think you would want Abundant Growth, for example, the aura that draws a card and lets your land tap for any color. And so you can shave those. I think Canister said that if he had to slim it down to 60 cards, Ice Fan Commander would be the first thing to go, and that lines up with my experiences as well. So that's another 3 or 4 slots there, and then maybe you could lose another land or two, but as we've both mentioned, we feel like the land count for this deck is almost more optimized for a 60 card deck than an 80 card one in the first place, so I don't know how many lands you can afford to shave, like maybe just 2 or 3. But in terms of the raw numbers, I think it's easy to get it down to 60. As for whether you would want to, I think, especially as these decks become more popular, having access to Yorion makes you so much better in the longer games that I don't know if that's even worth considering. But if you think that it's a more structurally sound deck when you get to 60 cards, then I could maybe buy that argument.
Yeah, I don't think that slimming down to become an aggressive Time Warp deck is what you want. That said, I do think there might be a false premise here where you're saying this 4-color Eat Witness Time Walk stuff. I played against, I'm blanking on the username. It involved Time Warp or Time Walk. It was like, like one of those ones where like you should know your opponent's on an extra turns deck. And they were playing a Teamer Ragavan Ren and 6 Time Warp deck that it was like really impressive. I think that putting Ragavan into your deck as like, is there really a better mana engine in the format than Ragavan? I think that is the way I would want to approach a 60 card Time Warp deck, is to make my deck a Ragavan deck on the low end. And then from there, you can extend into like the Ren and 6 Time Walk kind of stuff or Time Warp.
Yeah, we've had this question come up in the standard context with Aaron's Epiphany. And if you have any views on that card, at ARMLX on Twitter. But usually those Time Warp effects, what they ask from you is to find some kind of continuous advantage over the course of several turns. So whether that's planeswalkers or just creatures that are good in combat, applying a lot of pressure, and you just need one more turn to get over the finish line, or Ragavan, right? Like that's the typical example of a card where if connecting with Ragavan once is good, connecting with it again is going to be pretty good as well, especially with the additional treasure, making it easy to cast whatever you stole from them or to work towards some other play yourself. I think that kind of setup just intuitively makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, that's about all I have to say on the deck right now. I think is the kind of thing you want to consider if you need to like adopt some of the 4-color practices while like trying to get bigger in the mirror. Because I think that the like 4-color control deck, one of the things it might suffer from is if you're playing a mirror against a more combo oriented deck, you might struggle. So I think that might be the place you want to kind of consider it as the format like folds back in on the 4-color decks. But yeah, I like the more aggressive slants if you're trying to become a Time Warp deck.
Mm-hmm. Joseph Schuster says, love your podcast. That's not part of the question, but we love that you love it. So thumbs up there. And the actual question is, most of the hot deck choices going into the Invitational, these various 4-color decks and Esper Reanimator and so on, seem particularly weak to Blood Moon. If you planned on playing Blood Moons at the Invitational to take advantage of that, what deck would you use to deploy it, and how would you play them? Your main versus sideboard, how many would you have, and so on. So completely agree with the premise there. I think Blood Moon is a great card. What do you think is the best home for that card at this moment?
I think that the only thing I'm sure of is that I would want to play it with Ragavan. I have tried that Jeskai Stoneblade deck, and I think it's just like untenable on the draw without something to take advantage of on turn 1. Like you're just like, I'm going to cast Stoneforge Mystic on turn 2 when I'm behind, and it will turn out great. Not going to work out. So I think you absolutely need to play Ragavan, and I'm inclined to play Blood Moon in the side. It's not entirely like, some of it is like, yeah, Blood Moon's bad against some of the decks, but like weirdly Blood Moon in these, I think you want Ragavan to be threat dense and to have sideboard Blood Moon. And the equation going on there is that Blood Moon is better as the games become more interactive. So in game 1, like if your opponent isn't interacting with your spells, Blood Moon is like a very polarized lock piece. But if you're like this threat heavy deck and you're putting Blood Moon in your sideboard, you actually get full use of it against the control decks where you're like, I'm going to sideboard in Blood Moon. I'm going to cut their ability to cast Counterspell or like multiple answers in the same turn. And then because of that, they are going to lose to my Seasoned Pyromancers or whatever.
Yeah, when you say Ragavan and Blood Moon, my mind actually jumps back to the Willie Adel Rakdos deck from the like Uro Field of the Dead days, which was just the most Zoomer like black-red deck you can imagine, but just had 4 main deck Blood Moons to clown on the 4-color people. And maybe that approach is worth revisiting. You do lose a lot by giving up Lurrus, but once that constraint is lifted, I would embrace that as hard as possible. So maybe you're a 4 Fury, 4 Blood Moon deck, for example, where at least one of those cards is going to be good against any given opponent. And if both of those are good, then you actually start to look pretty favored no matter what the specifics are. And then, being a Inquisition Thoughtseizes into Blood Moon deck, like that's a very solid plan against a vast swathe of the format at the moment. You can play Seasoned Pyromancer for some of that, cashing in these polarized cards for new ones. I think there's something there to explore if that's the playstyle that you want. And so Casey, to jump ahead, asks, how do I go about deciding which of the black-red base Ragavan Lurrus decks are the best choice for a given week? If you're not logged into playing Lurrus, then maybe this is an angle that's worth exploring. I think the more mainstream answer is Temur Crashgate. And as I said last week, to me, that's almost the appeal of the Crashgate deck more so than the actual Crashgate components, is being the best home for cards like Blood Moon and Endurance and even Mystical Dispute and so on and so forth. And I actually don't know if you line up the 3-color version. I don't know if that's Boomer Crashgate at this point versus Doomrake's not a Zoomer. I think he's a bit long in the tooth. But the hot new thing, the 4-color 80-card version, if you're Temur with main deck Blood Moon, I think you actually are favored on that exchange. And so you already have a bunch of flex slots in the main deck there for your choice of 3-drops, essentially. Maybe Blood Moon is the 3-drop. Maybe that's the way you want to build that deck heading into this tournament.
That sort of makes sense. I could get behind some of that. I also would like to cite Izzet Murktide? And that was specifically what I said. I think that, Joseph's question here made me think about this, because I put Izzet Murktide on my top 8 list because I started filtering through what Blood Moon deck I would want to show up with. And it just came back to, it's Murktide's bad against control or whatever, but it's still a great deck, and I'd play multiple Blood Moons and it would be fine.
Yeah, and so one other question from Nick Align was, can we get your thoughts on MTG Milan's Jeskai Murktide deck, which I have not really looked hard at the specifics here. Maybe getting access to stuff like Prismatic Ending is worth a splash, but I think what would draw me to Izzet Murktide is, again, being a shell that can support Blood Moon, maybe even in the main deck, and I don't think you can actually do that once you move to the Jeskai colors. So yeah, I think Murktide probably is fine with a focus on disrupting their mana, whether it's some mix of Alpine Moon, Spreading Seas, Blood Moon. I've had at least 2 out of the 3 of those played against me on, Amulet and the various 4-color decks, and I think leaning hard on that angle is the place to be if you want to stick with that deck.
Yeah, and we actually got a related submission from Pensor MTG, which you may recognize as the name of one of the players who's top-8'd recent challenges with Izzet. And they mentioned that they agreed with me on moving towards Blood Moon, but actually their list, I haven't actually seen Milan's latest list. I tried to look it up before this, and I couldn't quite find a tweet with it. But the thing I would consider for Jeskai is actually Prismatic Ending as the reason potentially to be that. But Pensor's latest list was pretty heavy on Brazen Borrowers and Engineered Explosives, with presumably the same intent of being able to take care of Chalice of the Void. And I think when you can answer that same question just literally within the Izzet colors, this question of my opponent has something that is big, like their Murktide region or whatever. Well, I can just Brazen Borrower it. I can Brazen Borrower their Chalice. I can answer it on the way back down. It'll all be fine, and you get to maintain the integrity of being a Blood Moon deck. I think that the flex slots in the Izzet deck can play a pretty big role in taking care of a lot of the problems that you would actually want to splash a color for, even just within Izzet.
That makes sense. I don't feel qualified to speak on a lot of the individual card choices in the Izzet decks and where it should go going forward. And I know you've dived into that topic extensively yourself, so happy to defer to you on that one. But from my distant, ignorant standpoint, Blood Moon seems like the answer there for me. Andrew Ellenbogen, the last official Pro Tour champion, asks, should Hammer be playing Dark Confidant in its flex slots at the moment, as some of the Magic Online PTQ lists have been doing? I don't think so. It just seems so mopey to me. I know in that debate of, Giver of Runes versus Ingenious Smith versus some of the other options, Ingenious Smith has become somewhat popular, and the one biggest mark against that card is it's another 2-drop. And Dark Confidant is another 2-drop that doesn't give you that same immediate return, doesn't dig for your combo pieces in quite the same way. I can buy that this is the answer to the blue-white matchup, for example. It seems the card does seem phenomenal there. It seems pretty bad against almost everything else, and even the 4-color decks. where Ren 6 is a big part of the equation. In theory, Ren 6 can clean up an Esper Sentinel or a Mem Knight or whatever, but that exchange always felt so clunky. And if, you're playing Ren 6 and you're giving them a card because they have Esper Sentinel, and then you're killing the Esper Sentinel, I don't know if you actually ended up ahead on that exchange. Whereas if you play Ren 6 and just murk their Dark Confidant, that feels good from the 4-color side. So I don't think Dark Confidant is a card that has aged all that well in Modern, and it feels weird that it's kind of coming back into a vogue at a time where the format is more efficient and more demanding than it maybe ever has been.
Yeah, I would not want Dark Confidant this week. Maybe there was an argument for it during the super heavy Azorius weeks, but as soon as you start having to face Ren 6 and Fury, I just want to stay away from it. Whereas Ingenious Smith has lined up extremely well against both of those cards.
In particular, for a tournament where I expect burn to be a big part of the equation, don't want Dark Confidant in my deck at that point. So
yeah, you can sideboard Dark Confidant to beat Azorius if that's what you want, but that's about where I'd be at.
Yeah, if the comparison is Dark Confidant versus Knight of Malice, I could buy that Confidant wins on that angle. But in terms of as a main deck card, I would stay clear of that.
Yeah.
Moving down.
Do you want to jump back into this Rakdos Ragavan Lurrus question? Because I think there's an interesting debate to be had about Mardu versus Grixis versus Jund here. Just real quick.
Yeah, these decks are not really in my wheelhouse, so I have not been getting in the trenches exploring Grixis versus Mardu versus, I guess, Jund Saga would be the front runner here. I have not been overly impressed by Jund in recent weeks. It's kind of been popping up in the top 8s here and there, but its metagame share does seem to have fallen off a cliff compared to just 2 or 3 weeks ago.
Yeah, I think that the big issue is that I keep talking about Sanctifier on Vec, and I think the number one reason to play Jund is that it is the best Rakdos Ragavan deck against that card. Even if I don't even this is a tweet debate I had with Brad Nelson earlier today. I don't actually even think the Jund deck is good against Hammer. It's good against Hammer opponents who donk it up. But if your Hammer opponent just is thinks a little bit about how not to die to a Kolaghan's command, it gets really bad really fast. The Hammer deck is just all a bunch of 2-for-1s. Anyways, I don't really want to go down that rant, but I think that if you do not expect to play against Sanctifier on Vec, then you can have the debate of Mardu versus Grixis. And that comes down to, I think, a very specific question of whether you expect your opponents to be, if you're playing against a bunch of control decks, I would much rather be the Grixis deck, because I think that burying your opponents with expressive iteration is a pretty big deal. And I think that if I was going to play against a metagame that I knew had basically no Hammer in it right now, I think that Grixis might be a reasonable decision to make, because I can see Grixis kind of shredding through Azorius and maybe to some extent the 4-color decks, though Yorion might be a tough ask. Where you want the other, the Rakdos Mardu style Ragavan decks, those I think are a better ask when you're just I need a Thoughtseize deck that is going to beat the spread. And that is where they're not that much more aggressive than the Grixis deck is, but they're less slow card advantage base. And you have Kroxa, which is a pretty powerful override. And you have more broad scope answers like Prismatic Ending and Kaya's Guile. So that's kind of my breakdown of that is if you have concerns about Sanctifier, you have to play Jund. After that, it just depends on how much you need to beat the spread versus beating other grindy decks.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like a Sanctifier is as popular now as it has been in the past, so maybe you can get away with that. Or I don't have enough reps in with Mardu to know if stuff like Prismatic Ending gives you enough coverage against Sanctifier to bring that back up to even, or if there's other stuff you can do, I don't know, Kozilek's Return in the sideboard, or whatever the answer would be there. If you expect a lot of grindy matchups and maybe some graveyard stuff going on, does Dauthi Voidwalker start to look appealing again?
Yeah, I think that's part of the Rakdos Mardu package against the spread, is the Voidwalker covering a lot of stuff that Grixis is just going to really struggle with.
Okay, so yeah, if you are a Rakdos enthusiast, I think the format is not closed to you. I think there are directions you can take. Don't quite know myself what that direction is, but I think that door is open for sure. Adnoth006 says, I've been listening to your podcast since the beginning and know that you are both off of black cards and current modern. in your opinion, is there still a place now or in the future for Death Shadow, even though the base power level of creatures in Modern has grown so much? And that maybe ties back into the previous question to some extent.
Yeah, I think the answer is a resounding yes. However, the problem is that Solitude has to cease to be part of the top tier first. I just don't think you can have that lineup occur.
Yeah, I don't know if Solitude itself is a death knell so much, where like, yeah, sometimes you get those games where you're all in on 2 copies of Death Shadow, and Solitude explicitly kills one and then implicitly kills the other at the same time. If you have a broad enough threat base that Shadow is the main thing that is dying to Solitude there, I think that's okay. I think that's still tenable, or you could maybe even have a configuration where you board out your Death Shadows against a Solitude decks and have enough threats that that's okay. I just think that everything else going on in those decks is also kind of a nightmare for you, whether it's Prismatic Ending, Spreading Seas, Chalice of the Void, Supreme Verdict out of the blue-white decks, or just, Prismatic Ending, Omnath, and just a bunch of good grindy stuff out of the 4-color decks. It just feels like they beat you going long and have the tools to compete with you in the early game, and so it's a question of what are you hoping to really prey on at that point? I don't know if there is an obvious answer to that question right now, at least.
Yeah, I think the other big issue is that you are like set up in the perfect way for Ephemerate Solitude to just be the best thing possible against your deck. I think that's like a huge struggle. I think that once Solitude clears, I think that there is a consideration for playing Death Shadow. But the thing that we've seen time and time again is that you should not be pairing Death Shadow with Scourge, because that is what exposes you to a lot of the bad play patterns where you aren't getting out ahead. You should be playing Death Shadow in the sense of like, it's a lot like your Kroxa, but like a more efficient version of Kroxa, where like you are leaning on like Ragavans or Territorial Kavus or whatever to be your first threat out of the gates. And then once it comes to like the pseudo late game of turn 3, turn 4, you get to take a game action and cast this giant Death Shadow on the same turn.
Yeah, I think Shadow with Kroxa is actually a somewhat decent pairing, and you see those married with Dress Down in that version of the Shadow deck, for example. But if the idea is Shadow is no longer as good because they can trade 1-for-1 with you so easily, then Kroxa actually lines up very well against most of those cards, even Solitude, where, yeah, eventually Kroxa itself can get Solituded, they can hardcast it, and that feels bad. But if one half of Kroxa is taking them down a card, and you're applying enough pressure that they have to pitch cast Solitude at some point, and then you get to escape Kroxa, and you get another card, and now they have to deal with a fully escaped Kroxa, then eventually you just run them out of resources pretty quickly. And if you can stop them from refueling, whether it's with like Drown the Lock in the Grixis deck or something else, then or like Kolaghan's Command to do all of this again, then I think that's a fine approach.
Yeah, I guess we didn't talk about the Dress Down Shadow deck in the previous mention of Ragavan Lurrus decks. I don't exactly know when I would want to play that, but it might just be the good version of the Grixis deck.
Yeah, like sometimes Dress Down traps a Solitude that is meant to be eating your threat and then doing the thing again, and then there's a weird tension where when they evoke Solitude, Dress Down lets it stay in play, and so now they can like go for Ephemerate again on a future turn. So it's not a perfect answer by any means, but maybe if you can get the rest of the specifics sorted out, then that's a fine way to go. Moving on, Nathan says, a friend of mine just got into Modern and has been struggling to put up decent results with Is it Murtide, Azorius Control, Jeskai Stoneblade? What advice would you give to someone who is new and struggling to get a positive win rate in the Modern metagame? So that's a fairly broad question, but I think using those decks as a focus maybe can help suggest an answer there.
Yeah, I think that those are some of the most difficult decks in the format. So It was definitely starting off the format on hard mode. I don't think that if you're trying to get a positive win rate broadly in the Modern format, like there's this traditional crutch of like play Burn, play Tron. I wouldn't go that road. I think that if you are trying to like build up your Modern skill set and learn about the format, the 2 decks I would recommend are Reanimator, which might be, it sounds like a lot of the cards overlap there. Like if you're already in Azorius Control, like adding on the Reanimator stuff to like what you already have is relatively easy because you already have like Teferis and counterspell stuff. Or Crashing Footfalls. I think that you want to be playing a deck that the learning can come from the interactive games that you have to play, but I think you need a bit more of the raw power component if you're like struggling with the fact, like the win rate fact, because it's definitely like, you know, it's like I'm learning, but I'm winning 20% of my games. Like that's like really a tough struggle. But if you're playing like Footfalls or Reanimator, you're getting the free wins and the interactive experience. So those, if you are trying to like learn Modern while also not like being in the miserable lose every match hole, those are the two decks I would recommend moving towards.
I would also ask Nathan's friend, where are you struggling? And but by that I mean, where is this gameplay taking place? And the modern leagues on Magic Online can be a confusing and disorienting and demoralizing experience for all of us at various times. And it can be frustrating if you're trying to test for an event and you head into the leagues and you get paired against a royal sampler of everything that's going on in Modern. And yeah, you're not prepared to beat Mill today, so you lose to Mill. And then you lose to some like weird deck that has no right to exist, but it sure does line up well against whatever you're doing. And so you take your loss there, and then you just about eke out the 3-2 against your other opponents, but you don't feel like you've really learned anything, and you don't know if you want to go back into the league to try and improve on that result or learn something else. So if that's the case, can understand the frustration, and I think just stick with it, get the reps in, and I think you will feel yourself improve over time. But as you said, those decks listed there are ones that are hard to get those free wins with, and that immediate return on that investment. And even Jeskai Stoneblade, for example, where the appeal of the Stonefall Mystic package over a kind of a hard control focus has always been, sometimes you play turn 2 Stonefall Mystic and it runs away with the game. That happens so much less often now than it ever has in previous iterations of Modern. And so, yeah, I think it's going to be hard to, when you have to work that much for every win, it's going to be hard to feel like you've really improved over time. And if those initial results are discouraging, then it can be demoralizing. But I would say stick with it. And if you can, maybe extend your focus into a deck that does have a quite different playstyle and is more linear, because I think that is a big part of Modern, like it or not, and always has been, and it's worth dipping your toe in that pool, but also just as a palate cleanser, where if grinding out wins with your existing roster of decks is too difficult, or just not something that feels appealing, I think having a different option to pivot to is worth a lot there.
Yeah, and I just want to add two things that we pointed out in our Mulligan episode recently that I think are really important tips if you're like, I don't know where to start at getting better in Modern. One, aim to keep more proactive hands and like not fall back on true controlling hands quite as often, because it's very easy to lose that way. And then two, be more predictive with your opponent's companion reveal, including lack of companion reveal, because that's also just as important.
Mm-hmm. Moving on, let's some quick hits on some decks here. What are your thoughts on Affinity? I was surprised to see Hardened Scales given a C or B on the tier list, but Affinity wasn't mentioned. We have 8 1-mana draw 2s and a better bolt. Frowny face. Yeah, but the cards you're drawing all suck, and in order to get those 1-mana draw 2s, you have to play other cards that suck, so I'm not about it. I think there is a good Affinity deck in the format, but it doesn't have cards with the word Affinity on them.
Yeah, I think that the problem is that when you look at the old era of Affinity versus Hardened Scales, a lot of Affinity's raw power over Hardened Scales was involved in the Mox Opal hands that it was better at firing off. And it had these way more aggressive starts off like, I just put 4 counters on an Ink Moth and attack you twice, or like a turn 1 equipped cranial plating in the best case scenario. Right now, the problem is that that's equalized, and Affinity is like this slow and clunky deck because it can't be as fast, whereas Hardened Scales is like this explosively additive deck, and it's just a more raw, powerful deck. And then once you start getting down to it, it's like, well, I'm like a slow, clunky artifact deck, but like not really getting that far ahead of like Hammer in terms of power and card advantage. I struggle to see the role that Affinity plays. I can see it playing a role, but I think it's just like trying to slice through a specific metagame for a week where it's also not exposed to the hate. That's kind of my spot for Affinity now, and I think it's kind of a awkward spot for the deck moving forward.
Yeah, if I had to play Affinity, I would look at the main deck Chalice configurations, where that is 3 wins against one half of the format and a good half against like another third of the format, I suppose. And then I'm a really good Urza Saga deck, and that gets me a long way by itself. And then Cranial Plating and Nettlecyst, and I would want as many of those effects as possible, mean that I can grind through a bunch of Solitudes and Supreme Verdicts just by making every Mem Knight I draw into a serious threat. I think that would be the package I would focus on there, and you could sell me on that, honestly. It wouldn't take too much work, but right now, I don't think the Thoughtcast and Frogmeister of the world have what it takes. And then someone asked, Skylar Runner, is the resurgence of Lantern Control a flash in the pan, or something to seriously consider when choosing a deck? You don't have to worry about Lantern. I don't think there's that much of a resurgence beyond Canister trying it again on stream out of nostalgia value and doing well. How much of that is Lantern versus Canister is up for debate, I think. I think if you own a Lantern deck and you want to play it, you're justified in doing that, but I would not expect to face it. Certainly not at SCGCon and probably not online either.
Yeah, I think that the big issue is that Prismatic Ending is just like a card in half the decks in the format. I know I specifically had the lineup of playing the Jeskai Phoenix deck against Lantern when I was trying out that deck. And it was just like, so we're just going to do this? Like, I'm playing the deck that Lantern is supposed to be like a huge exploit against. And even before sideboarding, I'm just like, okay, kill your Ensnaring Bridge, you're dead. I don't really think you want to touch Lantern unless, and that's a big unless, we start seeing basically no copies of Prismari Command and Prismatic Ending for a couple weeks.
Even against Hammer, which I think should be one of your natural targets there, the fact that Ornithopter with Sigarda's aid can get around the Ensnaring Bridge, like, you just have a bunch of those accidental lineups where it's just pretty bad for you. And the Hammer deck is so fast that if you land a Ensnaring Bridge and you still have any cards left in hand, you might just be dead anyway, because they're gonna, their Esper Sentinel gets to attack and now it gets to get really big and you've died. And so a bunch of decks just accidentally have cards that line up good against you. You mentioned Prismatic Ending, Prismari Command, even just stuff like Expressive Iteration, right? If you can't deal with that, then that's a way which is hard to regulate with your lock pieces that lets them dig through their deck, and it's just everything is an uphill battle at this point. But I think the deck is like a fine C-tier player, and if you want to cause some people to never come back to FNM again, then I think Lantern is a good way to do that. So moving on, QED2 says, what existing cards currently not legal in Modern, either supplemental set or pre-8th edition, could they put in MH3 that would improve the format? And then what cards do people think they want, but would actually be bad or dangerous? So where do you come down on that?
Oh, that first question is tough. I'd have to think. I saw this question, I thought about it, and improving the format is tough because of the range that they've pushed it to. I know my immediate answer of what cards do people think they want and would be bad or dangerous. The answer is Daze. Just like, get the hell out with that. I don't even want to address this question. Like, it's not going to make, like, Modern's big edge over Legacy in terms of fun is that you get to cast your freaking spells. And guess what? You know what you don't get to do in Legacy? Cast your spells and have them do stuff. Your opponent's just like, oh, I'm going to just daze all your stuff and it's not going to matter. Like, Counterspell is pushing the line. Counterspell is one of the best cards in the format, and they put it in. And it involves your opponent paying mana to answer your spells. Just get out of here with this stupid daze stuff. Just never again. I don't want to like have this conversation about daze. I'm sure I will again, but it's not going to make anyone's life better to put daze into Modern.
I would say get daze the hell out of Legacy too. This is not the platform for that, but Wasteland, another one that people say, well, let's balance Modern by putting Wasteland in there, and wouldn't that be a great answer to Urza Tower and Simic Growth Chamber and so on? Like, yeah, it would, and those decks would immediately cease to exist, but also the gameplay for everyone else in the format would become completely miserable as well. Like your burn deck, right? You play your Goblin Guide, your Inspiring Vantage gets wastelanded, you have no lands left over, game's over. And that experience is going to repeat for every other deck in, what, like 25, 30% of games? The format will become completely miserable. Going back to the first part, what cards, not legal in Modern, would I want to see in there? I was surprised that Pernicious Seed was not in MH2, like this iconic card, which when we spoke to Gavin Verhey, and he mentioned wanting to get some of that like invasion through Onslaught era stuff into Modern in some regard. Deed is a card which falls squarely in that time frame, beloved by players who were playing back then, and I think would be an interesting element here where it's kind of clunky and slow, but at the same time, it's clunky and slow in a format where everyone is playing a bunch of 0 and 1 drops, and so it's pretty good at cleaning all of those up, and specifically Urza Saga it cleans up Saga and everything that it's trying to get there. So I think Deed would have been a good inclusion.
Yeah, along those lines, Serenity might be a good choice. As you can hear, my sleeping dog has a lot of opinions on this subject. But yeah, Serenity might be an okay choice along those lines of like a similar like workable hate card that's going to clean up an Ursa Saga, but like has some leverages. How would you feel about Birchlore Rangers or Wirewood Symbiote making their way into Modern?
The Elf combo fan in me would love that. I don't know if it would be fully healthy necessarily, but I think that without the card Glimpse of Nature, like that might cement that card's place on the ban list for a while to come. But I think the resulting glimpseless elf deck might be a fun addition there to explore.
Yeah, there's probably some like crazy commander card or something like that from like Conspiracy or I don't even know. One of the fake sets that probably would be a nice addition to Modern. But I'm going to leave that up to the Modern Horizons 3 designers' jobs because they actually have to look at the card files and I don't.
Yeah, cards that I would not include on that list, Doomsday, Caracas, some of the others that we've seen floated as potential inclusions by the designers themselves. And more on that in a little bit, perhaps. Maybe this hypothetical elf deck doesn't even need Glimpse, like when you have Realm Walker and you can, I don't know, Summoner's Pact for Regal Force or whatever, Court of Calling. There are ways to stitch this together and keep the cards flowing even without Glimpse of Nature. So yeah, maybe that deck would be close to being too good. I know that there was a time where I thought Elves with Cloudstone Curio was actually a very good deck, and Glimpse is not legal then either. So maybe something to think about.
That's fair. No Monarch cards. Absolutely none of that.
No.
We're going to get to that in a second.
Okay. Yeah. So as a related question, Cora asks, what mechanic would you want added to Modern? And I'm guessing Monarch is not, in fact, your answer.
Yeah, I think that my response to this question is kind of weird because I think that basically all the mechanics I want in Modern were added via Time Spiral being a giant crazy mess. This quite like the question of what mechanic do we want to add to Modern was asked like multiple times, and I think that there's a pretty good reason for most of them to have not made the cut. When I was thinking about this, I was trying to think through any of the like weird mechanics from like Odyssey and Onslaught blocks that were like, there was a weird era where like they just printed mechanics that didn't have names. I think that if I was looking for a mechanic that I wanted to add to Modern or maybe even bolster in Modern, I would be going back to those two blocks, Odyssey and Onslaught, for inspiration, because the mechanics in those blocks were pretty darn good.
Yeah, it's as you say, Time Spiral got all of the good ones into Modern initially, and then the reprint sets that had Time Spiral in their scope, like the first Modern Horizons and so on, just got to double down on that. And so you kind of got all of the good ones from that pre-Modern time frame anyway. And then all of the supplemental set ones, a lot of those have this weird multiplayer specific wording, and maybe you could clean that up for 2-player, but then you're kind of reprinting the cards without reprinting the cards. It's a whole mess. I think my actual like fake answer here is every single set mechanic, because we're in this weird era of design where the cards have to be pitched towards standard and limited primarily. And so a bunch of the set mechanics, so using like werewolves or coven as an example here, none of the, if you think about the setup requirements for the coven mechanic, to take that as an example, it's pretty hard to make that work for standard, let alone any larger format. And so that mechanic is kind of dead on arrival for Modern. But I think it would be an interesting question to ask, what would a coven card that was priced to move for Modern look like? And we maybe get to explore that like Modern Horizons 3 in 2025 when this set finally enters that orbit. But you have to wait a long time for that. And then you kind of get cards smuggled into casual formats and exactly Legacy, but not Modern. And I'm still not sure why that's the case via the Commander sets, but then those are pitched at Commander, and that's a whole different kettle of fish. We really don't get to see these new mechanics being pitched at a level which is explicit for Modern, as opposed to these are the good cards. And if they're good enough, then maybe they end up clearing that bar. And so as a result, that stuff just, like, we allude to it when we go over our previews for the new sets, and maybe one card gets across the line accidentally. But in terms of this is what a fabricate deck or a fabricate strategy might look like for Modern, that just is dead on arrival. And I would like that to change, because I think that's how you get past this problem of all the decks just being like MH2 block constructed, for example.
Yeah. I actually went back and looked, and I think I have come up with one of two answers to which mechanics from Odyssey and Onslaught block. There are two things from... I would like to see one of two cycles from Judgment revisited. I think that a true Wish cycle for Modern would be interesting. And I think that a Incarnation cycle in line with the Judgment ones that are active out of the graveyard would be interesting. I know we just got Wonder, but I think a more appropriate cycle of those, or like the Genesis / Glory cycle, might be an interesting addition.
I know we've just seen the card Wish, like that's it, that's the card, be added to Modern. How would you feel about that initial cycle of Wishes being reprinted in MH3, for example?
I would like to see something other than the stupid 5-mana Golden Wish nonsense that was balanced because Battle of Wits was in Standard or whatever. I think that that's reworkable, but I think the others would be good. I think Living Wish would be awesome.
Yeah, Living Wish. I think Burning Wish and Living Wish at 2 mana may be a little bit dangerous, and maybe that's how we get combo back by itself, is the Wishes, more so than anything else, because that tends to be where they slot into the format. But I'd be kind of down. I don't know if... Yorkmoth with Living Wish, Amulet with Living Wish, like maybe it's pushing things a little bit too far, but hey, why not? See what happens. Let's get some nice Gravestorm cards. Why not? Let's light a little fire under the format, and we're gonna have to ban a few of them, but we're gonna have some fun in the meantime.
Okay. Next question about that, without thinking about Gravestorm. Danny R asks, what one card we'd be comfortable unbanning in Modern, and then we got 3 questions here. Card to unban, favorite card to cast. We'll start with those two real quick. I believe my favorite card to currently cast in this format, that's actually a really tough question, because I've been playing such like a wild spread. It's probably Persist targeting Archon of Cruelty is probably my favorite thing to do in the format. Okay.
I think my answer would be Omnath, just because it does so many things, and those beget even more things, and some amount of that is, I get what I want, and then I get a whole bunch for free on top of that. So I get the several cherries on as icing on top of the cake to mix my metaphors.
Yeah, the problem is that it's like, I think a lot of the things that are the most fun to do in Modern are the things that are like very clearly not super fun for your opponent, but I think that's okay because there's a lot of stuff going on in the middle. In terms of one card to see, this one card to unban question is very dangerous, because I made the statement that every time anyone talks about unbanning in Modern, they're immediately a dunce. So whenever you like say exactly one card to unban, you're going to make an idiot of yourself. So I'm just going to go full on out and say I would like to see what happens with Once Upon a Time unbanned.
That was going to be my exact answer too. Yeah, I think it's like, okay, hear me out. It is clearly a completely ridiculous card that never should have seen print, and it is somehow not even the most egregious offender from its own set. That being said, I think it at least supports like a lot of different things, and I actually don't know. If you look at the current crop of top tier decks in Modern, like I guess stuff like Yawgmoth or Amulet would get a real shot in the arm, but you can't just put this in your Ragavan deck, for example, or your Cascade deck or whatever else. Like, it does actually have certain requirements to it and certain diminishing returns, and you don't want to draw 2 copies. So you still should not unban it by any means. But if you had to unban something, you could talk me into talking them into this.
Yeah, I think the thing about it is that the way the format has shaped up is this like interactive, proactive mix. And Once Upon a Time pushes a set of archetypes that is completely outside that realm. Like, you want creatures and lands, and that's what you want. And we don't have Modern decks where it's like, yeah, I really want all my creatures and lands. It's like, nope, I'm mana efficient. I've got just enough creatures and right amount of interaction. Like, Once Upon a Time is not the card for those decks. I'd be interested to see it pushing the like Yawgmoth style of decks to more compete with those.
Yeah, so maybe brings Heliod back into the mix. Who knows? But taking that dunce cap off for the time being, or maybe immediately to put it back on, Liam asks, if they had printed the suspend channel, how good would it be? And so this alludes to a Aaron Forsyth tweet from a few days ago, revealing some of the cards that did not make the final cut for MH2, and some of those were a little more dangerous than others. And this one was, I imagine, the card that eventually became Glimpse of Tomorrow. So this is Channel the Old Ways, I believe is what they called it. No mana cost, suspend 3 for RR, and it has the channel text. So you may pay 1 life to add 1 colorless mana to your mana pool. And it struck me that in a format where Hypergenesis was immediately put in jail and has remained there for 10 years, never got to play a sanctioned modern tournament with that card, and also we just had to ban Tybalt's Trickery for its interaction with Cascade cards. I don't quite know if this is what we want to be unleashing on the modern format here.
I just don't think that card would be playable. I think that the
Really?
decks that it constructs are fundamentally worse than the all-in Eldrazi versions of the Glimpse. Maybe not fundamentally, but I think that the like all-in Eldrazi decks from Glimpse are like a similar type of strategy. And I think that like the channel just exposes you to so many other issues. Like you're like, okay, I'm on the draw. I've got my channel deck, and your opponent's like Ragavan, and you're like, oh, I just don't have a life total anymore. I can't do anything. I think that card would be. It's the kind of card that wouldn't be good, but it would be absolutely miserable in the games where it functions.
Yeah, it would definitely be miserable. I think it would be pretty good. I think if the things you're casting are like Ulamog or Emrakul the Promised End, where you're getting some amount of discount there, you don't need all that much life to play with. And once you know this is a thing you're doing, I think you can construct your deck in such a way where like you're going to have a double-digit life total that you need by the time you get to turn 3, turn 4, whatever it is. And it is just so fundamentally miserable to play against that. Like, I'm glad this is just a hypothetical question and not an actual one that we had to consider. But in the all-time egregious Cascade power rankings, where you've got like Hypergenesis and Valky and whatever, I think this should be in there for sure.
Yeah, maybe. I just, yeah, it would not be fun. We'll just put it that way.
Yes. I guess we'll close this out by circling back to David Booker's question, actually, because I think this is one that certainly is relevant heading into the tournaments this weekend, but also to any tournament 2 years from now, too. And so this is just the deck selection process leading up to the event and then in the days before that. And he calls me out for switching it up constantly at the last second and usually being able to stitch it together. This is very much a do as I say, not as I do here, where I am guilty of that behavior, but I would not endorse that process for anyone else.
I think that it just depends on how strong your like broad background is in a format. Like I have definitely played flat, like fast and loose with my modern deck choices over the years, just because I have played a lot of modern at basically every point of the format's existence. And therefore, I felt comfortable at like any given point in time. Like I can pick up this deck and I know every matchup because I've played every matchup with something and can just like derive from first principles how the matchup's going to work. I don't think like it scales based on how experienced you are with the format and with time. So I guess in terms of selecting a deck, I think that the primary question you have to ask yourself for the like, is this event going to be a condensed metagame versus not? And from there, you can kind of like decide how much you are leaning into like choosing the best deck versus targeting. I brought up an important point earlier, which is very easy to fail and like probably something that everyone fails more than they should, which is just like always consider why the answer is just not like, why don't you just play the best deck? Like you should consider that way more than I think you are. But like, you won't because just everyone fails at that because they want to try something new and better, but just like try to do it more. In terms of like the thought process and like, I tend to just like play a lot of things and I'm pretty good at like quickly assessing like this is going to be fundamentally good or not. And then once I have this list of like fundamentally good decks, like whittling down like which ones sound good in a like specific metagame, it might be better to be able to establish some kind of like, I don't know. I have tended to fail over the years in spots where the deck might be like unexciting, but there's something that is workable as opposed to like exploring a different option. And I don't have a good answer how to decide like when to tune a deck versus when to decide to try something new to see if it's better. Like that's like an eternal question of like how you spend your time.
Yeah, I think that if you are expecting to be switching late, it's either because you're in the position that you're in with Modern, where you've played so much of it over the years that you kind of you've explored all of the territory there. And so it's a question of finding out what matters right now and then what optimizes for that. Or it's because there's no frame of reference. And so, for example, when you used to have Pro Tours in week one standard formats of a new set, I know that Sam Black used to like settling on a deck on like Thursday morning, and people would ask, why are you doing that? Why not just decide earlier and then spend some time optimizing that? And his answer was always that I want to spend this time finding out what matters in the format, and then I can build something from scratch that is tailored towards those priorities once I know what those are, but I need that time in order to discover that. And so if you're at one of those two extremes, then I think it makes a lot of sense to settle at the last minute, because you either have all the information you need or you have no information and you just spend your time figuring that out. If you're anywhere in between, I think it's usually going to make sense to decide as far in advance as you can and then work towards getting, your existing competency with that deck up to the cap of where it can be. Or with Modern, if you have been playing the same deck for years and years, and this is part of what has given the format its enduring appeal over time, then work on optimizing that deck for this weekend, figuring out what your sideboard needs to be and what your sideboard plans are meant to be, as opposed to last minute switching to the hot new thing, unless that thing is incredibly broken. And maybe that's a topic for a different time of identifying when are you in one of those situations, as opposed to, this new deck is good, but it's just another one of the good options that you could be playing. For me, I like a lot of the times I have done well is picking up a deck blind, because I think that I've had some sudden last minute realization that this is why this thing is good, where I wouldn't have considered it before, or there is some truly new information that forces that late switch. But often when I do that, it feels like there is something being lost in translation there. And if I had just put certain work in at some time before, then I could have got to that process with less friction or had even more success there. So would not endorse that process, even though it's the one that has worked for me in the past, because I don't live in that counterfactual where I do have a more refined process and it's leading to even better outcomes. So always worth keeping that in mind. I guess the question there specifically is, if you're someone who doesn't have that time to burn necessarily, if you're working in 9 to 5, you have other commitments, but you have a tournament that you do care about, how do you optimize what little time you do have? And that's a process that I know you have had to confront over the years and have had to refine your own approach to.
Yeah, I think this is all kind of more of an art than a science. Just trying to think through. In terms of like time expenditure, I think that like you should try to find other people you trust and try to split that responsibility. And that was kind of like the whole focus of like the last few years I played on the Pro Tour, where like we had a group of people who were testing who all were, employed professionals who also played a lot of Magic. And we tried really hard to delegate and like lean on other people and produce information in a way that was like transferable. But that itself is like a whole process. So I would just like, find some friends who you trust and like figure out what you can cover with the time that you have. And like, hopefully you can trust other people's results in some fashion.
Yeah, I think there is also enough public content about both general stuff and specific stuff out there right now that if you're looking to get up to speed quickly on something, you can do that. And maybe it's subscribing to this person's Patreon and unlocking whatever it is, or it's watching back VODs on 2x speed or even higher if you can unlock the secret source there. But by and large, I think a lot of the general stuff is just a question of you need to put the reps in over time, and there's no way to accelerate that. But if it's I want to learn to pick up this deck and I don't have the time to run through leagues in real time in 1x speed, well, you can go and catch up on the VODs of someone who did that in 2x speed and read this article and pick this person's brain who maybe in general is not the person you would go to, but for this like local maximum, you know that they are the best source of information. So I think identifying that maybe is, if you're someone who still has not settled on decks for the Invitational and you're hearing this on Tuesday before the Invitational, that's going to be a pressing question for you, right? And so I think you can have Wednesday night, Thursday night to go back and, check that out and get up to speed. And you can do that now in a way which maybe you couldn't even just a few years ago when a lot of that was just didn't exist or was in a different medium or whatever. I think it's a difficult time now where things move so quickly that you have to stay up to date, but there's enough information out there that you can stay up to date. So that does place demands on your time, but there's a way to optimize that where even if you have all this other stuff going on, you can still find the relevant stuff when you need to, I believe.
Yeah, I think that you made a pretty important point there, which was that you should not be like 3x watching people's streams to try and like see the broad metagame. You should be asking yourself the question of like, well, I want to learn about this deck, and then use their stream as the resource to do that instead of like playing a ton of matches.
Yeah.
You should not be just like trying to like stream the matrix of Twitch into your eyes to make a metagame decision. You should be using it as like, I am looking like, it's like the let me Google that for you, but for like, let me play this league for you.
Yeah, I do find it fun if like, I don't need to use my time for anything specific, just to open up 6 streams at once on Moddy Twitch and just, via osmosis, absorb whatever I can and just like zone out in front of that. That can be fun. But if you are trying to use your time wisely, then that has to be directed to something. And so, if there's a 6-hour VOD of a challenge run, then yeah, you can't get through all of that in one night, even on some absurd speed setting. But trying to find, okay, I know they played against Hammer in this event. I know I'm going to be playing that matchup myself. Let's find out how this player sideboarded there and what matters in the matchup. You can do that, even if it's a question of jumping back and forth and trying to isolate that one experience.
Yeah, and I think skipping around is important there in terms of prep. So I would not be afraid to like skip around the VOD if it's like taking a while. Just kind of like maybe see where the game ends up and then go back if you're interested to how it got there, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so this is taking a while. So let's skip around to something else after a very short break.
With this break, I'd like to talk to you about Star City Games Premium. For years, StarCityGames.com has been hosting the best Magic the Gathering strategy content on the internet, and Star City Games Premium is a huge part of that. If you want to see great articles from Pro Tour champions, world champions, and many other accomplished players, as that content comes hot off the presses, subscribe to StarCityGames.com Premium. More than that, Star City Games Premium comes with a host of benefits when shopping at StarCityGames.com. Premium members save 5% on Magic the Gathering Seal product, 10% on singles, and 15% on supplies. There's even special benefits on SCG Tour Online event entries to keep an eye out for when those events come around. All that savings and all that content costs just $7.99 a month. For the price of 2 booster packs, you can be on the cutting edge of Magic the Gathering strategy, getting insights from the best in the industry on Star City Games Premium.
All right, let's close this out with our nonsense of the week. And I think this will be a brief nonsense segment, and it's one which we intended to cover last week, but got sidetracked by a whole new fresh batch of nonsense distracting our attention here. And this is a blast from the past in its own right with a few new updates. This is a Dimir Inverter with Murktide Region. And I think we actually alluded to this in passing when we previewed the card and in our very first episodes with MH2. But we didn't actually see anyone pick up that ball and run with it until now. So this is really fun to see.
Yeah, I enjoyed seeing this. It is notably a worse card by like a lot than like Dig Through Time is in the equivalent previous Pioneer deck. But it is a interesting additional angle to take with the deck. I also kind of was interested in the fact that this deck was just like hyper loaded on Jace and like under on Thassa's Oracle. Maybe that's just like a push towards having better cards in your deck. I don't have like a ton of thoughts on this deck. I just thought it was cool that like Murktide Region is the Dig Through Time of this format, I guess.
Yeah, whereas in Pioneer, Dig Through Time let you find those 2 pieces of your combo or anything else that much more consistently. Here, Murktide Region is the thing you have going on when your combo isn't coming together, or it isn't what's relevant. And there is an interesting duality there where the matchups where the inverter combo is at its best is going to be against these 4-color decks, for example, where the game can go for 14 turns, but if the game isn't over yet, then you just get your A plus B together and you win on the spot. And that's the appeal of the inverter package, is that it just sidesteps everything else that's going on and lets you win through basically anything that's going on the board. Whereas Motide Region, it very much does care about how your cards line up against theirs and so on, but sometimes you need a blunt instrument to stabilize the board or to win the game. And so that idea of I'll Inquisition this thing and I'll Fatal Push this and suddenly here's a 7/7, that much more like tempo interactive game plan is good enough of the time, but it's good when the inverter combo isn't. So it's like a nice hedge in that angle too.
Yeah, I struggle to believe this is a great deck for the format, just like on the basis of like Fatal Push, Inquisition, Thoughtseize not being a good package of interaction. But if you can figure out how to like resolve that issue in another way, I would certainly consider going back to Inverter, because it is a unique angle that I think is potentially good for the format, like an interactive but like hard kill combo deck. That I think that's good in the format. I just think that you need to resolve, like I said, this issue of like, I don't really want to play Thoughtseize.
Yeah, I mean, in part, I think those cards aren't good because they're not building towards anything good. And this is something good to build towards, where you have this plan that goes over the top of anything and anyone. You just need to get there. And maybe those cards buy you enough time to do that. Worth noting, too, that this is both a good Spreading Seas deck and a good deck against Spreading Seas, where you are so heavy on blue pips required by the end that, if anything, Spreading Seas helps your somewhat flimsy mana base sometimes. you can be grateful for that. And with Archmage's Charm in the mix as well, you get to play this more just flexible game with the good cards, and then either you make a 2-mana 7/7 or 8/8 and hope that that's good enough, or you have this like weird out-of-the-box combo that no one can really play against, and that might be good enough sometimes too. And between the two of those, something should be good enough of the time to make this work, I hope.
Yeah, that sort of makes sense. I think maybe the solution is you want to splash Prismatic Ending as well, and just play like a good removal spell instead of push.
I see why you would want to do that. This deck, I think, it has 2 colors. Its mana base is a little flimsy, so I don't know if
that's fair.
I don't know if the third one is super free, but you do also have the nice thing of sometimes you run up the score with Murktide Region, where you play Murktide and then you load up your graveyard again, and then you play Inverter, and you do the thing, and you flip your graveyard on your library, and your Murktide Region just grows out of all proportion, which is 0% of why either of those cards are in your deck. But sometimes you get to do that and feel good about yourself.
That's pretty awesome. I hadn't considered that. Do love to hear that.
So on that note, I think that's going to do it for this marathon episode ahead of this weekend. You can find me on Twitter at DomHRV. You can find him on Twitter at ARMLX. And you can find both of us back next week with, I think, Innistrad Crimson Vow previews. Is that?
Yeah,
we can have those by then?
Those start Thursday, I think.
Dear God, it never ends. But whatever it is, we will be back here with it and with more nonsense of the week next week. Take care, everyone.